Looking for someone, I guess I'm doing that.
Well, I think with Trespass is that we kind of feel is really the first kind of proper Genesis album. The Genesis Revelation stuff was songs we'd kind of written with the original intention of other people doing them, and no one else would do them, and then we sort of modified them a bit so they fit this kind of broad concept we had, and then just recorded them while we almost just left school. Very simple. We never played live or anything, and we just I played mainly piano on it and stuff. By the time we did Trespass, we'd been playing on the road for a few months, and we had a whole, obviously about an hour and a half's worth of material, and we just recorded what we thought were the sort of better ones for Trespass.
From the beginning, we set out as songwriters, and we were sort of quite happy to be writing what were effectively pop songs. But I think there was always inside of us a yearning to explore, to push the boundaries, and to mix styles. And as we started to get a little more adventurous, it got too out of mainstream, left field for Jonathan and for the publisher that we were working with then, Joe Roncaroni. And so we sort of parted ways at that point. And at the same time, we were rehearsing and I think building an identity and a sound. And Trespass was really the first opportunity we had to make a real album where we felt, we were in the driving seat, if you like. John Anthony was there as a producer, and he was a great sort of man for performance and getting the energy. But I think the sort of the style and the arrangements and the approach was all determined by us for the first time.
From Genesis to Revelation was kind of an album kind of embarked on in a very naive way, but with a huge amount of fun. But I think we always felt that we had a lot of say, despite Jonathan King obviously being the sort of head honcho. I don't think we sort of felt that we were not doing what we wanted to do. Conversely, with Trespass, I don't think we sort of felt suddenly kind of emancipated from some sort of odious yoke in a way, as if this is going to be completely different, because we had a producer, John Anthony. The material was very much dictated by what we'd done on the road. I think I'm obviously speaking for myself, but I think I remember the feeling with the others that if we'd had more time, we would have actually gone back to some of the music that we'd jettisoned. Because, recorded music is different to live music, but the tendency then, having been on the road, the pressure of the schedule, was to do the music that you were touring with, particularly if it's complex, because there wasn't enough time to rehearse new stuff. And we jettisoned all this sort of, what you might call sort of more adult, progressive, from Genesis to Revelation acoustic music, because it had just died on the road.
I think in a way the Trespass album was our first album as a band, you know what I mean? Genesis to Revelation was really a bunch of kids in a holiday time, which is fine, and an amazing opportunity, but between that album and Trespass, we'd become a band. We'd done live concerts, we were on the road, we were gigging band, we'd played together, we'd done the cottage era. And I think really it's a strange album in some ways. The first album we actually ever did, only album we actually ever did, where we played it live before we recorded it, which I wouldn't do again, funny enough. But it's the first album I think that we felt like a band.
I was 17 in 1967, and that was an amazing year to sort of be entering adulthood. I'd sneak out from school and go down to the Electric Garden in Covent Garden, it's this basement club, and you'd see all these oil projections on the wall, and it was third-year band or all this psychedelia, really, that was just the Indica galleries. There was so much going on, IT and Oz magazines. There was this cultural explosion happening, and it was this sense that youth, for the very first time, was taking over the world, and hypnotizing, intoxicating, that every barrier was being smashed down. And so, in our small, little isolated cell, we definitely felt connected to that. I think me probably more than everybody else, but this sense of trying to do things in a new way, in a different way, and that was very important.
I think we were sort of influenced, obviously in the early days we were very influenced with the Beatles, Beach Boys, Kinks, all that sort of stuff, which produced, which is still sort of very, very influenced on us throughout our career. But by that time we'd heard groups like Family and the Procol Harum album, Shine On Brightly, and Salty Dog, and Fairport Convention, and the way they were doing things interested us. It just showed slightly different approaches. You weren't trying to write hit songs, trying to sort of make music sort of do a little bit more than that. And this appealed to us. And the idea of having a bit more room to breathe, songs creeping up to sort of 7-8 minutes, just seemed a lot more exciting to us. And the idea of being able to develop.
People often liken us to, we were in that era of sort of Yes, ELP and stuff, and actually they were very different as they are to us. You listen to Stagnation and those sort of songs, it's an acoustic album, We were always about songs and a bit of playing, but the playing sort of came secondary to the songs, I think.
Fairport Convention influence and the acoustic guitars was quite a big thing. Ant Phillips and Mike, used to play these two guitars together, and they do a lot of interweaving sort of parts and the harmonies they created between them, which was very much a sort of part of early Genesis, and strong part of it actually, and certainly led to the start of what was probably the best song on this album, which is Stagnation, I think. Which is starts off as an acoustic thing, which was a little idea of Mike and Ant's, and then it developed by the whole group into a sort of a bigger piece. But it was a very, I think that was quite unique. In fact, no one else really sort of was quite doing that, but it did come from that sort of Fairport sort of roots, I think.
There's a paradox here, you see, because Tony was more from the sort of classical side, but loved pop. Peter was probably heading more towards soul, but the guys that were into the heavy stuff was Mike and I, because we've been in the schoolboy bands, doing Stones, Kinks, and Beatles, and a lot of the heavier bands, and we were the ones that were writing the sort of really sort of third-rate kind of blues riffs and stuff. And we were much less sophisticated to start with. I think what sorted Mike and I out was going to the 12 strings and finding a bit of refinement there. But we were introducing, when we started with this experiment of playing live, we were introducing some very third rate. There was a song called Going Out to Get You, which we used to do, which had a pretty indifferent sort of kind of riffs. I loved all the heavy stuff. I don't think it's true to say that Peter was making us go in that direction. I think that Mike and I wanted to go down it, but it's a good thing we didn't early on, because we weren't very good at it. It's the truth of it. When the sort of the songs were developed out of the more refined songs into a heavier element, then I think it had some originality. What Mike and I were bringing to start with was sort of late sort of Stones, kind of Paul Stones riffs and stuff.
The folk sound of it, I think, was definitely from Ant and Mike and this 12-string combination, and I think that was really quite innovative, and I loved it, and I think tried to encourage it from my point of view, because they do these things where they get a composite chord. I know this is getting technical here, but one guitar will be playing, one chord and another chord, and you'd read the final chord as a composite of the two. Very boring for most people, but the effect of that was to give us a sound that was, I think, quite unique. And early on, we had one local paper who described us as folk blues mystical. And we were trying always, I think, to sort of, whether it was church music or whatever the influence, whatever the passion, to try and blend it. Nowadays, that seems nothing special. Everyone takes whatever they want. But at that time, music was very segregated. And I remember sitting in some publisher's office, and I think it was a record company, and they were saying, no, you have to decide what you want to be, and then you're a folk group or you're a blues group or whatever. You can't try and cross all these borders and barriers. And I feel that's what I've been doing my entire musical career, is trying to, whenever someone puts up a barrier, I try and find a way through it.
some of the songs there developed out of things that we'd written as in sort of the way we used to write, which is Ant and Mike writing together and Peter and I writing together. The Knife particularly was the thing Peter and I sort of put together, and then we kind of developed it in the studio and looking for someone's like that as well. And then obviously things like Dusk and White Mountain on this album came more from the Ant and Mike side. Visions of Angels was a song that was left over from Genesis Revelation, which we then developed and made a bit more of to make it into a big live song. So, I think we were starting to write as a group, but it's still some vestiges of the individual writing there. I mean, looking back on the album, I like, it's not, I think it was a pretty good, well, I call it first album, it's really a second album, I suppose, pretty good for where it comes in the thing. And I think Stagnation is great. And I'm probably looking for someone. The other songs on the album, don't quite do as much for me anymore as they once did, I mean, I always felt Dusk was a bit of a B track. It sounds okay. And White Mountain used to do that live, and that was quite nice live as well, quite atmospheric. But it was not, I don't think it's as strong as what was to come.
Because we'd played a song so long live, we went in the studio fairly inflexible. We'd found a sound, that's the way it stayed, you know what I mean? And it was in a way a little frustrating. The way we worked after that, we went in with the songs, having never played them live, so actually you could mess around with the sounds. You didn't quite know where you were going sonically. With that album, we defined how the parts went and the songs were. So in a way, that was kind of a unique experience.
It was slightly more sophisticated recording than from Genesis to Revelation, but not a lot. 8-track, I think it was. Can't remember. I know that John Anthony wouldn't let anybody drop in. So I remember Mike had a bit of a classical guitar at the end of Stagnation about 6 minutes in. He had to sit there, listen to the whole track. And of course, by the time it got to this bit, he was so nervous that he fluffed it, and started again. So it wasn't that sophisticated. But there were more tracks. I was able to double track a guitar solo, which would have been on the Knife. Oh, what a giveaway! Which would have been unheard of, from Genesis Revelation. There weren't the tracks. So yes, it was a bit more sophisticated, and it felt a bit more sort of big boys-ish up to a point.
It was a very rushed sort of thing. You went in there, you had a sort of day or two to do it, and it was quite quick thing. And I mean, I remember being quite nervous, really, doing. You didn't want to make any mistakes because, it wasn't the ability you have now of sort of going back and repairing and overdubbing and stuff. The whole band went in there and we all played it, and you went on and did a take until you got something that was halfway decent from all of you. Particularly the drums, because that was the one you really couldn't do anything about. Some of the other stuff you could, but it was. I just remember going in there and just playing the songs. But they were pretty well, we played them on the road, as I say, for a few months, and we were pretty much okay on them, I think, and we just played them pretty much as we'd done them on the road.
It was kind of pleasant because it wasn't too difficult because we knew exactly what we were going to do. It was nice sounds, nice crowd of people. John Anthony was really fun, very humorous, a lot of bad filthy jokes and stuff all the time, which we were a bit sort of, but he was great, and so it was kind of, I think I just sort of coasted through it, really, to be honest. I went through it on autopilot, is the truth of it, actually. There were no arguments. There'd been so many arguments when we were writing. There was nothing to argue about, really, except the level of whether the organ was higher than the guitar or whatever. So, and John Anthony was in charge of that. So no, it was pretty pleasant, to be honest. But no, I mean, I think by that stage of it, I wouldn't say I definitely knew I was going, but I wouldn't say that I was really pretty much on autopilot, actually.
I could barely play bass on the first album. I mean, I wasn't much of a bass player. I'd been playing more guitar with Ant, and then, of course, obviously he's the lead player, so I had to play bass as well as acoustic guitar. I mean, I just think the initial period in Christmas Cottage, where we did that sort of 6 months in the country writing, that's when I felt the band formed as a proper unit. And so it made anything after that feel very different in a good way.
Here today, the rent sky tells his tale, but the only listening eyes are mine.
Stagnation, that was a journey song, as I call it, that you didn't follow the normal verse, chorus sort of structures, but you went on through a series of landscapes, and I think right from the word go, that was something that interested me, and it continues to interest me in sort of stuff that I do. I mean, more often now with sort of film work than film soundtrack stuff, but I love that, and I think some of my favourite pieces of music are when I, as a listener, get taken into different worlds made out of sound, and if there are some things that you've not encountered before or blends that you haven't met before, then it pays off even better for me. So I think that's what we were aspiring to, and that's, I think, one of the tracks that did that, and I think that was probably one of the most band composed tracks on the record.
The Stagnation developed out of a piece that we'd had rather pretentiously called The Movement, which we'd been rehearsing for sort of like for a long time before we played it on stage or anything. And it developed, this thing at one point was about 30 minutes long, and it sort of got condensed, and bits came and bits left, but the first bit stayed. So it was always a sort of key song for us.
It was really a sort of 2 12-string thing that Tony got in on very early, and it wasn't just right to say that, we did the sort of chordal basis and Tony just put solos on top. It was more than that. I think his sort of kind of cross rhythms and cross harmonies influenced the way that the 12-string harmony went. Again, it was fun because you had this feeling that maybe we're just going somewhere slightly differently to other people in a very natural way.
Peter used to play a lot of flute, really. It was nice for us to have an instrument. You must understand, those days, obviously, keyboards meant just organ and piano, really. That's all there was. And I sort of got a fuzz piano going, piano through a fuzz box, which got some good sounds on it. But the flute, which Peter played, was a very strong thing. And he wasn't a great flute player, and he would never say he was, but it was a lovely touch in there. And and things like Stagnation is the melody, the big melody at the end, the sort of riff that carries on and on, starts off as a flute thing. And it's a really nice thing, and it was a really nice quality to have in there, I think. Obviously later, once the sort of mellotrons and everything came in and synthesizers, we sort of, it went by the wayside. But it was, it also gave Pete something else to do when we were writing songs. I mean, he didn't just sort of sing, we were banging tambourines and the rest of it. Obviously sometimes it gets a bit frustrating, I think, for him, because he was, he was a person who'd like to have had his hands on the keys quite a lot of the time, but I wouldn't let him, So he could play the flute, and then that would be a nice way of writing it. It would give one a sort of another dimension to the sound.
I just hated the idea of being just the singer, that as soon as the lyrics, which never got heard much because bad PA systems in those days, stopped, you were left with nothing to do musically. So you either had to prance around or get off stage or stand still. Whereas I wanted to, I was full of music. I wanted to play something. Tony was extraordinarily possessive about the keyboard. Flute, I'd done a bit of at school. I always liked the sound, and a little bit of oboe. I was even worse oboe player, but it made a couple of good noises now and again. And then the bass drum was something physical, visceral that I could kick hard, and occasionally it was in time. So that was important to me, to be in the noise-making department as well as the singing.
Stagnation to the Knife is a great example of what we do. The contrasts are always how we create our music, in a sense. And that album, starting with Stagnation and then having the knife on it, which is our heaviest song, and a popular live song too.
Tell me my life is about to begin. Tell me that I'm a hero. Promise me all of your violent dreams. Light up your body with anger.
Well, The Knife was a very popular stage song. And we used to construct our set in those early days. One thing we used to start acoustic, and I used to play a lot of guitar. And it would start with the first 2 or 3 songs I'd play guitar on, and then with Stagnation would be the first sort of song that had anything else in it. Then of course that song itself develops, starts off with just the guitars, and then the keyboards come in, and there's even an organ solo, and then the whole thing becomes drums and everything comes, and there's a big thing at the end. So, and then The Knife was the kind of final song in the set, and it always got the audience that they always loved it. It was that sort of the rhythm, it was just sort of always, even people who weren't sort of quite sure what we were on about, they heard that and their heads were all going. So it was a key song for us in those early days, and it became very much, I think, for that first sort of year or two we were touring, the key song, the trademark Genesis song.
I'll give you the names of those who must kill. All must die with their children. Carry the heads to the palace of old. Hang them high, let the blood flow.
Well, the knife used to be known as the Nice because we were big fans of the Nice, and I'd sat around. There was an energy. The Nice, people, not many people know much of their work nowadays, but it was what actually drew us into Tony Stratton Smith. And although, Keith Emerson was, associated with some of the sort of more extreme departures of prog rock on the keyboard, then it was a sort of hip underground band that Hendrix wanted to join. Now, people forget that, but they were amazing. It was powerful. It was sort of inventive, driving. I mean, maybe Soundgarden might be a sort of modern day, well, latter day reference. And obviously Emerson was a great performer. He used to sort of rock forward and back with a knife. And I was thinking, and there we would be, sitting on stools, twiddling away at 12 strings, and you'd think, where's the balls in this? Let's get something with a bit of energy and a bit of something a little dangerous. So we didn't have anything like that, so I started to try and write something that would have that energy, and that's really how things began. And then Tony added a section to it, and obviously the keyboard thing at the end. But I think it was the first sort of peak of a darker energy that we discovered, if you like.
Standing in a forest gazing.
That was a very early actual piano song from me, pre the first album, in fact. I mean, it was sort of in 1960, early in 68. I mean, I couldn't play the piano at all in a conventional way. I used to play with 3 fingers in my right hand, octaves there, and then I would cross over and play a tune there, which is very bizarre. And I think Tony thought I was an idiot, which would be understandable. But like a lot of idiots, sometimes you come up with something that's quite just a little bit different, and it has something, because I was helped by the fact that I was very limited. Sometimes too much skill isn't necessarily a good idea.
Visions of angels on a rock, dance in the sky.
There was that sort of plodding sort of piano style that was very fashionable. The Beach Boys had done it a lot. Beatles were doing it a lot. Things like with a little help from my friends. That sort of plod rhythm. And so, that fitted well with my octave, dun, 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 that kind of thing. Which the middle section with Tony's keyboard, the chords, and all that sort of glory that it gave, it made so much difference to it. And obviously, it was actually a song that was quite well suited to being dramatised a bit. Both vocally and in Peter's performance, and with the organ. So I'm sure if it had worked on Genesis to Revelation, we would never have done it. So in fact, that was a nice consolation for it not working out, because I remember at the time I was rather heartbroken, because it was definitely my flagship song on From Genesis to Revelation, and it got chucked off. I didn't argue about it, but I didn't know it was ever going to see the light of day. So yeah, that was a really nice bonus, and that was one of the few, well, it was the only one from that previous era that survived.
Looking for someone. I guess I'm doing that.
That was another one that was sort of, felt like a song which I'd brought to the band, and the band had then extended, and it was a sort of soul-influenced piece. But it then went into this sort of folkier journey, and I really was pleased with that mixture.
Trying to find a needle in a haystack. Chilly wind, you're piercing like a dagger. It hurts me so.
It was, it was fun to sing. I always liked to try and have, in the different voices our work within to have a bluesy one, and that was more sort of soul influenced.
In peaceful shades of green.
Our relationship, obviously, with Peter was a very close friend of mine at school, and Ant and Mike were the same, and then we sort of coming together there. And obviously on this album we had John Mayhew as the drummer, who was the person who was actually our third drummer. Someone we picked up really through ads and stuff and everything, and we were sort of slowly getting some cohesion going, I think, between the five of us in that way. It was quite difficult for John, I think, because we'd all been to the public school and behaved a certain kind of way, I think, which must have been very irritating to him, I'd have thought.
It was the summer of many drummers, many adverts, many auditions, people being picked up from stations, skullduggery, cloak and dagger stuff, who's going to tell him, and all that sort of stuff. It was awful, absolutely awful, because we'd loved John Silver, and John Silver decided to pack it up and go to the States for university. He didn't want to give it a go. John Mayhew was older than this. He was more experienced, but I think he was from a different background, and he was very unsure of himself with us. And I think we tried to do our best in our own rather lame way to make him feel comfortable, but I'm not sure we ever did. And he was a good drummer, but we were very demanding, very, very demanding. And I think he always felt he came up short. He didn't really. He did a fine job. The trouble is, the history hasn't treated John well, because his successor happens just to have been one of the very, very special drummers. He not only was a drummer, but a singer and all the rest of it. Brilliant musician. So I think, had they found a sort of more prosaic drummer afterwards, then history would speak more kindly about John. But he's cast in a rather dim light, which I always think is rather unfair. I think that we were pushing boundaries and trying to do this and probably being very demanding. And we'd spoken the same musical language. We'd grown up in the same environment for a long time. There's no way John could really understand what these toffs were on about most of the time. And I think he did a pretty decent job. It just wasn't clearly quite good enough.
We were used to sort of having this passive-aggressive tone to the rehearsals, because although Tony and I were best friends, we would be at loggerheads very often about the music.
It was very close, but we used to fight an awful lot, terrible arguments and shouting matches and going off. I was probably the main instigator of that kind of stuff.
He was then a lot more nervous and not at ease within himself. He would try and, in a tight way, hold on to controlling as much as he could in a lot of ways. And I would always want to push it wide open and, let the sunlight in and the rain and see what grew. And Ant and Mike, for the most part, got on pretty well, and occasionally, I would be in battling out with one of them, but Mike tended to avoid confrontation. And then, in later years, Phil and Steve would avoid the confrontation. But I think, Tony and I were the most frequently at odds.
We argued a lot because we were passionate. Also, we were young. Sexually frustrated, I don't know, all sorts of reasons it was just one of those things. We did feel intensely about it, really, and you find yourself, you look back on some of the arguments you had were just about sort of pretty trivial things, but when you're close to people like that and you're living on top of each other, little things can trigger an argument, it's just about nothing at all. And that's first, the cottage period when we were just all living together, we weren't even hardly taking weekends off or anything. It was quite a strain on those people who did actually have relationships. So it was kind of, it was difficult, but it was intense. But it had some great moments there too, and I remember it, being as a sort of mixed period, really, some great moments and some violent moments.
No, we were passionate without question about getting something great. But I think, we were both awkward buggers, difficult sorts, so it was some of that personality as well.
It was a difficult period. There were some great moments and some awful moments, to be honest, during the writing period of this and everything. But then once we started playing on the road, it got a bit, once you started this audience response, it all started to sort of, make sense a little bit, really.
My parents, bless them, are supportive. I mean, if you see your children really keen to do something, I think you have to support it. I'm sure they're hoping it wouldn't last, I'll grow out of it. But because in all fairness, in those days, as parents, there was no possible conception that you could have a career making this kind of music, pop music. They hadn't really seen that. And so, in a sense, supporting, I think that they were very good and very brave in that way, I think.
There was parental pressure, and in fact, John Silver, who'd been the drummer after Chris Stewart, and is a wonderful guy, and had, as was Chris, but John had actually been very good at encouraging us to develop sort of an individual personality and to push the folk thing. I mean, he was a sort of jazz fan, really, in lots of ways, and he dropped out definitely because of parental pressure, and he ended up, at Cornell University in America, and he said afterwards he was sort of still hoping he'd get the letter welcoming him or inviting him back, whereas we just thought, okay, well, that's what he's decided to do. Fair enough, he's off. And with John was much more of a professional musician who'd actually played with real bands of musicians rather than a bunch of songwriters, pretending to be a group. And so he had sort of different sets of experiences, and I think he was having a difficult period in that time, and he worked really hard and was very dedicated and delivered, I think, well in some places, but it still felt a bit of a struggle. Just on the drum side of it, I mean, Ant was the other person who was also drum sensitive, so I think he and I sort of overlapped in some of those areas, but between us, we would have a lot of ideas for what the drum parts should do, in much the same way that I think, Paul McCartney did with Ringo. And obviously, as soon as Phil came along, that role was unnecessary.
I went to university for a year, in fact, and then sort of took a year off, and then took another year off. And I think my parents always hoped I'd go back. And I knew that I felt this was an opportunity that would only come. You get opportunities. It was one that was there, and I thought about not doing it. And then I thought I really would miss this. I really, really want to do this as a chance. And at that time it was an incredibly slim chance, as you must understand. And so we just sort of slowly, I don't know, we were able to do it. I think back in that period of time, 1970, there were an awful lot of clubs and things you could play where a band like us could just play support probably to some other group, in front of maybe 80, 90 people, maybe less or less. When we headlined, we were playing to sort of, sometimes a little sort of 5 or 6 people. I mean, that's what you were doing, But you had a chance to learn your craft, and you could actually, you just about could get enough money to keep yourself going.
Many people have been puzzled how the hell we did so well and how the hell we survived for so long, when in a lot of critics' eyes, the music is unlistenable. So, and I actually think that it's because it's based on songwriters, and obviously we built a very strong fan base playing live, and I think it was those two things. But if you look at, say, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, 10cc, other bands which are songwriter-based rather than musician-based, I think you do see sort of long lifespans, maybe, or not all in the same direction, but it's a different sensibility. Most bands begin, playing together and then find writing, whereas we wanted to write and we found playing.
People never realise that, in a way, I think, apart from Peter, who was always very get up and go with agents and managers and the business side, in many ways, that first era, Ant was the strongest driving force. Extrovert on stage, musically, he was very strong, I think. So the concept that he might leave was probably nowhere near in our thoughts at all.
In many ways, Ant was the most musically gifted, I think, of all of us, and it was, I think, a great loss when he didn't sort of continue on beyond that. I mean, it was he was also the most obsessive, I think, in a lot of ways, and some of that culture, I think grew quite unhealthy. That a life was not a concept that the band would sort of consider or allow beyond what we were doing. It was a bit like joining the army. And it wasn't really, from an authoritarian sort of point of view, there was just this really powerful group mentality that it had to be 100% total commitment. And, that, I think, also has its cost. And although I think Ant was very uncomfortable playing live, and that was part of it, but it was also, I think, extremely stressful. And in part, it was self-imposed and then group-imposed stress.
Anthony, for me, was kind of the group leader. He was the one who wanted to go live. He was the one who wanted to go professional. He kind of motivated the rest of us really to do that. Peter and I were not sure at all that's what we really wanted to do, but he was the one who wanted to do it. And initially, I think we almost stayed. The first summer we started doing this. We did it because we were a four, and we sort of did it before with the intention that we probably wouldn't stay and they would find somebody else. And then of course we got more into it and everything after that. So we were very surprised. Then Anthony was the one who sort of seemed to suffer from stage fright and everything, and that kind of, in a sense, was sort of perhaps ultimately the reason why he left. But there was no feeling that he was going to leave at this point. So it was a very sort of difficult thing. And I mean, at this point, we were very definitely looking ahead, for that this was the group.
Well, that was nothing to do with the music. It was just to do with the sort of stage fright and sort of things that just health, really. I just had kind of, found it really tough. I'd started well and then come unstuck, really. That's why I was saying, on the album I was pretty much sort of on autopilot because these things had already happened. So the recording, in a sense, was quite pleasant for me because there was no sort of huge pressure. Because I'd sort of internally put myself under huge pressure on the road. I mean, you might have thought that being in Trident Studios was a huge, but I didn't sort of see it that way. It was kind of very pleasant. No, that was all to do. It wasn't. There was nothing. There was no sort of kind of left for musical differences or huge personality clashes. No, I just found the touring had taken a huge kind of toll, really.
I'm conscious now, having just finished this book we've done, and hearing his side of things, I was kind of saddened that I didn't quite clock what was going on. We were very close, Ant and I. And I think at this stage I had a girlfriend and we saw each other less, and I kind of drifted away a bit. And I wasn't really aware just quite how bad his stage fright was, and he had glandular fever. I know he was run down and everything, but I didn't quite. I'd have thought that I'd know him so well, I would have really been able to get picked up what was going on. But I often miss things. But I didn't. So in a sense, it was a shock when he told us. In those days, for the first 2 or 3 albums, we had Paul Whitehead, who was a good artist who kind of, at the time, was involved in doing album covers and stuff. And so you kind of, and also there's that nice gatefold sleeve which you don't have anymore. So you kind of let him go. I mean, you let someone go away and do something quite that excites them, and then see what you got. And he looked great with the big sort of knife slash across, I thought.
Well, that was quite a nice idea. We saw the music we'd done. A lot of it was very sort of pretty and romantic music. We had this one song, The Knife, which was anything but, a sort of violent song. So we just pictorially did that. We said to this guy, just draw a fairy drawing and then knife slash through the middle with a knife sticking out the end of it. And it was sort of, I think it's quite good really, because it's deceptive, Genesis, sometimes. You sort of see them as one thing, but in fact there's this other thing going on right from the early days, I think. And we've always had those two sides to us, sort of, it may vary a little bit really as to how you define them, but the sort of romantic side and the sort of more aggressive side, it's a very important part of what we do. And so I thought that particular cover actually was really good, because it was, it was supposed to be a kind of like a cliched sort of fairy story kind of like cover, and then with this knife on it, which did something special, I think. Best of the early covers, I think, in many ways. Well, best of the first 3 covers, anyhow.
We talked to Paul at some length, and he heard some of this sort of folky stuff and mythical bits, and I just felt it was getting too twee, so I suggested that we get a big knife and slash it, which fortunately, there was a lot of discussion about this in the band, but in the end, they went for it. And whereas I was going to go for quite a crude knife, I think Paul in the end chose this sort of more elegant dagger, which wasn't quite what I'd had in mind, but I think it did a job, and for fans, so I had again its own personality, which is what we wanted.
I think it seemed to be a pretty good compromise between the kind of folky sort of tendency towards slightly sort of medieval echoes of, and then there's the sort of harder edge stuff. So, and you want to draw someone's attention as well. So a great way of combining it is you've got one thing which is a sort of the characters plus this knife slash, which might look a bit OTT and grotesque to some people, but it seems to me to be a pretty good reflection. And you can see commercially why that was a good move.
Well, Trespass was a big advance for us from Genesis Revelation. We'd been playing live for a while, and I think it was the first album where we start to play as a group. We actually know what we're doing, and everything sort of starts to coalesce. Really, it's in its position in the Genesis thing, it was very important. It was a kind of because it set the trend, I think, of what was to come later. It's definitely the first of the Genesis albums as people came to know them, and from that point of view, it's very important. I think we still had a bit to learn, and I think one or two of the songs in there, perhaps a little bit slight in comparison with what was to come later. But at its strongest moments, which, as I said before, I think Stagnation, I think it's right up there.
I think it was a good start. There was definitely a personality that was different to other bands and prog bands at the time. So it was the first thing, I think, to set us apart. And we had, I think some minor success in Belgium, which felt like conquering the world at the time.
I would think it's sort of a very good early Genesis album. Obviously, there's many better later.
I'd describe it as our first album as a proper band. That's how it felt. We'd become a band and made an album. We hadn't heard it for 30 years or 20 years, so actually you go back and you kind of often reevaluate and go, well, that's really quite nice.
I think we wanted to develop it. I think we wanted to get more energy into it, more a darker feel too, and expand, if you like, the horizons of the musical world that we were living in. So things were beginning to work live, in one or two clubs around then. I think Friars was a key one, and Angel Godalming, and then Newcastle, Glasgow. It was quite strange because, we seemed to get through in sort of southern Europe and then tougher working class cities, and it was a sort of strange balance, and it was harder for us, in the sort of more cliquey, cultured world of London and some of the big cities.
Anthony Phillips left, and so we had to make the decision. I originally thought when Anthony, as I said before, I think Anthony I saw him as group leader in many ways, certainly the most influential person in the group. And I thought when he left, we probably would split up, actually. And then we had a conversation. Mike and Pete were very keen to carry on, and Richard McPhail, who was our roadie but a good friend and a sort of a big fan and everything, said there's no way you must carry on. You've really got something going here. So all these things came together, and we had a meeting, and we decided that we probably felt we could do better on the drums. That we liked John and everything. He was good, but he wasn't. Just felt we could have someone more creative in the drum seat. So we had to make this decision, and so then we were just auditioning, for a guitarist and a drummer.
I stuck loads of ads in Melody Maker, which was the paper that was the most powerful at the time. Loads of bands were formed off the back pages of that. I think the odd Rolling Stone might have got a gig from that, or the odd member of Led Zeppelin. I think possibly the whole band like that. And it was 5 years of ads, and eventually this crazy guy called Peter Gabriel phoned me up, and I figured he was at least as mad as I was.
Well, I saw the name constantly in the back pages of Melody Maker, which always had the gigs that were on around town, around sort of, Greater London area, if you like. And they always seemed to be working. There was always them in Quintessence, I remember. And I remember complaining to my manager, or our manager, the band I was in, about, why are they working, we ain't, because we hardly worked at all. And really, I wasn't aware of their music at all, because we were actually playing all the time, but we weren't actually gigging. Until one day there was an advert, because I was kind of losing the plot with the band I was in. So I used to scour the back pages as well for jobs, and there was one box, advert with a box around, and Tony Stratton-Smith, who I knew very, very well. I had known him for years. And so I knew where to find him. I went to the Marquee Club bar and asked him if, cut a long story short, he said it was for Genesis. And I thought, well, at last I'll get to find out, what the music's like.
We did quite a few auditions, and I think so. I took a big role in that as a sort of drum fanatic, and obviously without Anthony, who was the other drum fanatic, we put ads in, went through all sorts, and I remember Phil impressed me because I think he said he played on a George Harrison session, and I thought, oh, that was very impressive, but I think he'd actually done sort of third tambourine. But anyway, we had a lot of people, including some, I think, really quite useful drummers. And we did it at my parents' house, which is where Tony and I used to do a lot of writing, and we did some rehearsing. Mainly the rehearsals at that time, I think, were between my parents' house and Anthony's family's house. I suggested, I think, that we devise a series of tests, because we didn't have long in an audition. I hate auditions anyway, but one of the problems with John is he was quite, once he got something, he could do it and deliver it well, but he was a very slow learner. So when we wanted to try different arrangements, different grooves, different feels, it was a painful and really time-consuming process. So we thought, okay, we'll throw some different tests at these drummers and see how quickly people pick up these ideas. Phil arrived early, as he often does. He was the most punctual member of the band always, but he was there with his mate Ronnie, and listening to the two other drummers, I think, run through these tests. So by the time he sat down, he knew it. As an ex-drummer, or still a part-time drummer, I knew just from the way he sat down in the saddle that he knew exactly what he was doing, just the way the body engages with the kit. It was clear that he could just lift the music. I think they always say a band is only as good as its drummer, and Phil is a great drummer.
The guitarist was more of a problem. In fact, we went out as a four-piece for about 2 or 3 months, I think, and which taught me a lot, because I ended up playing all the this piano I put through a fuzz box, that I played all the guitar parts that Ant had played, well, all ones I could anyhow, on that, at the same time as playing the organ part. So I was doing this two-handed stuff, which I'd never sort of really done before, but it made me mature as a musician, great amount. And although it was probably never great, the four-piece thing, we did get it so it wasn't too bad. And we started writing this, we did this piece, which became the musical box, which we started as a four-piece. And it sounded, we knew this was really good. We used to play it on stage and stuff as a four-piece. It was good. We had a guitarist for very briefly, a guy called Mick Barnard, who came in for a month or two. And he was actually good, but he just probably wasn't assertive enough, And while that really wasn't working, we then, we auditioned Steve. Peter and I actually went to audition him because Mike was having trouble finding. He was always looking for someone to replace Ant, I think, which he was never going to be able to do because he was a good friend and everything. So we said, right, we'll find a guitarist. So we went and auditioned Steve, and we were really impressed with him. We really liked the way he approached things. It was just different. It wasn't entirely the same as us, but he played these things. His brother playing flute and him playing these things on guitar, which were quite slightly more classical style, perhaps, than we were used to. But we just thought he had a lot of imaginative ideas, and he didn't want to be a sort of mad guitarist. We weren't looking for most guitarists. Either wanted to be lead guitarists, sort of teeth, or else they were just purely acoustic guitarists and weren't interested in either of those extremes. We wanted someone who could cover both ends. So Steve was a very important addition.
Away from me, cold-blooded woman, your thirst is not mine.
Well, what was great was that we were all a bit serious, and Phil was as drummers should be, was the joker. He brought this lightness to the band. I know you got a shock when we first started rehearsing at the Maltings, because suddenly, we had these huge rows, and Tony would stomp out, or I'd stomp out for 10 minutes, and he was a bit like, what's going on, And I remember he stayed in my house, my mum and dad, for the first sort of 10 days rehearsing for our first writing period. This is before Steve, but musical box time. And then after sort of 2 weeks, he went to stay with Pete. So he could get to know him a bit, And I think he always thought that actually I didn't like him. I'd kicked him out and sent him off. It wasn't that way at all. It was just like sort of sharing him, being around so you get to know him. So it must have been a funny time, the initial bit as a four-piece for Phil, but he just loved drumming and it was sounding good.
And the drummer's role has always been, really, the guy who sits there is a bit overweight, farts, drinks too much, cracks the odd joke, and deflates the tension, That's really what our role is.
It could go from a blazing row to someone sitting down playing the most exquisite, gentle music, and I just think, wow.
It's just extraordinary that we have got on so great, because at the beginning we were from totally different backgrounds. I was a grammar school boy, but I actually had just come from 2 or 3 years at drama school where anything went. I went out with all the girls, whereas they come from public school where there were no girls, and I kind of was very light-hearted and jokey and fully comfortable on a stage, if you like, even though I was behind the drums. And they kind of seemed quite, uptight. And again, part of that was because Anthony had left as well, and they didn't really know what was going to happen. He was a quarter of the writing, team. So we'd be playing, and suddenly, I don't know, we'd stop playing, and something would happen, and suddenly there'd be 3 of us, because we didn't have Steve at that point, and I'd say, wait, what's happened to Mike? He's gone. Or Tony, what's happened to Tony? He'll be back in a little while. A couple of hours later, Tony would come back, because something had been said by somebody, and I had noticed it, and very sort of lot of tension. So, eventually, it took a long time for that to be gotten used to, and also a long time for it to sort of disappear slightly.
Well, Phil and Steve's contribution, particularly at this stage, I think, was to bring a big musicianship into the group. I think, Mike and I, I was still learning very much as a musician. I was, it was okay, but nothing brilliant. And Mike was certainly still finding his way, I think, as a musician. Whereas Phil was a really high quality drummer right from the word go. He's got a great, brilliant sense of rhythm. And Steve, obviously, he was technically a better player than than we were at that time, I think. And that's what it really gave us, a bit of that sort of ability to sort of a bit of technique in there as well as everything else. Gave us a better chance to do things. For me, the contribution from Phil on the drums is what transforms it really, and you particularly coming back to them and remixing them. Just suddenly everything has a sort of lilt. It works in a way that it didn't. It was a bit stiff on Trespass, some of those things. And you listen on Nursery Cryme, and even there's those sort of complicated songs like the Giant Hogweed, they sort of have a much better flow about them, I think, for that reason. And Phil's other contribution, obviously, which we were aware right from the word go, was the fact that he could sing. The rest of us sort of made vague attempts at doing backing harmonies, which were okay. But with Phil, we actually had someone who had a really strong voice as well. So, And Phil and Pete used to do quite a lot of stuff singing in unison as well as stuff in the harmony work. And Phil was also very good at just picking out little harmonies, sort of a la sort of Crosby, Stills and Nash and things like that. Just little ideas would come to him like that. So they weren't contributing much as writers at this stage, either of them. But it was very much more as musicians, which in a way we were quite happy with because we had quite enough material.
Phil definitely just lifted the foundation of everything, just with great grooves, and I think everything could be done better in some ways, but and I think Steve, it was colouring. He was a colouring agent in lots of ways, and it was this sort of dark, contained personality that was struggling to get out. I think that's partly why we connected with people, I think, was that there was this yearning, longing build-up of some compressed energy that needed to explode and get out. And we didn't always get it out, but people could feel and touch the sort of vibrations humming beneath the surface, and Steve definitely had a good dollop of unfulfilled frustrations, I think, that were that gave it a good personality.
I heard the old man tell his tale.
Writing Nursery Cryme, we got together in Tony Stratton Smith's house and put all these and just started writing really and pooling ideas and things, and it was easier writing say than it was in Trespass, but it still wasn't that easy, I suppose.
We'd never really worked, well, they'd never really worked with us. We tried writing stuff. We were doing loads of gigs at the time, and the odd day spent in a windy church hall trying to write songs together just wasn't working, so we had to take time off. So we pulled out of gigs for the entire summer of 71. I seem to recall it was 3 months, which was unheard of in those days for them, working band. But it was great because suddenly it was a chance to work with a band, to a professional standard. I'd never really made an album like that. I'd done an album once before with a band called Quiet World, but that was very much sort of don't give up your day job, and it was great working with everybody. We just bought a new Mellotron, and it was just fantastic. I had a new Les Paul that I got courtesy of the band, high watt stack, lovely, felt very, very nice. And I practically never spent a night away from home, so suddenly I'm 3 months with these guys who are all talking the same sort of language. A kind of it was almost as if the band had their own kind of way of communicating. I guess the fact they've been at school for all those years. I mean, it was a little bit hard when I first joined. I didn't really understand what they were talking about. They had it was almost like the equivalent of Cockney rhyming slang. And Mike, for instance, and Tony, chord shapes on guitars, they would say, "Oh, that's a nice guy. That's nice." And I'd never heard that expression. They had their own world of Genesis even then.
It wasn't an easy writing session. I don't remember it being like that. But then, fair enough, you got new people for the first time. But looking back, it's got a strong character.
I was much more of a player, and you give me a bit of music and I'll play it, kind of thing. I wasn't really writing, apart from a few lines of Harold the Barrel, probably with Pete, and For Absent Friends. I mean, it's difficult, because it's one of these things where you never know what helped the bit. We were playing an awful lot together to write, a lot of jamming, as we've continued to do throughout the years. But I wasn't actually a bona fide writer.
I think it started with Ant, actually. Ant and I think. I'm sure it did, playing 12-string stuff together. And I had this Rickenbacker guitar that I tuned the strings. I started doing weird tunings. And this is a very bizarre tuning with it. All the top 3 strings tuned to F sharp, which is just mad. But it made that jangly sound. And it meant that big chord later on when you go bum bum, had this lovely open stringed feeling. And in fact, it's interesting because in a sense we were trying to work as a 4-piece and it wasn't really working. Tony doing all the lead parts on fuzz piano, you know. But actually, funny enough, this song was the first time I felt that it actually did work as a 4-piece. The sound we made, I'm playing pedals at the end and Tony's playing keyboards, and it's funny, this song, I think, I mean, had we gone the 4-piece route, this song might have been where we might have gone. No, it didn't. But in a sense, this song worked well on stage as a 4-piece.
Play me my song.
The first thing I noticed was that no one was actually making the sound of a musical box, and I thought, God, you know, here's an opportunity for me. So I did this thing, recorded at half speed, which was a little guitar lick going. And so that was, you know, my chance to be the Sugar Plum Fairy, perhaps.
Mike started off with the first dring, ding, dring, dring, dring. And, you know, I was a big fan of The Who, too, and I really wanted to try and persuade Mike to find something, you know, like a little Townsend arm-waving, you know, ballsy attacking section that we could add in there. And I think I was pushing very hard for that, and it was in the rooms in West Hampstead on the 28 bus route. And it was, I think, exciting when that sort of first came to gel as a piece. And I think my head at the time also was in this Victoriana world, which I pictured around my the house my dad had grown up in, and so this sort of controlled English mental landscape under which festered, you know, violence and sex was the sort of flavour that I was trying to bring in to the lyrics and vocals.
And I want, and I feel, and I know, and I touch.
I think it created that sort of fantasy, the lyric relating, you know, to all this sort of the old Victorian kind of quality it has, and the album cover, which related obviously to that as well. It was a very atmospheric piece. And it was musically interesting, and it went through all these changes and other stuff. It was a sort of precursor, perhaps, of what was to come later. You know, you have the little bits, and not a lack of repetition in the song. You can start off with one bit, which is a very strong section, that opening part, but it never comes back again, you know. And we used to quite like doing that. We used to just like using a bit once and then going to a very loud bit and then a very quiet bit and another loud bit and then a sort of serene bit. And by using the contrasts, I think it's a sort of song that has about a lot of contrasts in it, which, you know, again, is for some people is very appealing. And some people just find it irritating because it means it never settles into a groove, you know, it just sort of, you're doing one thing, oh, this is great, it's stopped again, they're going off, time change and everything. But, so it is a very sort of typical Genesis song, sort of that. It followed on from Stagnation, I suppose, you know, that same kind of thing, but perhaps a little bit more dramatic.
I never saw Family, the group Family, but there was a thing that they used to do called the Weaver, I think, which was a ding digga ding digga ding digga 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 ding, you know, kind of a rolling thing, and I had a pretty good foot, you know, so I could do ding digga ding, bum da bum da bum da bum, and they kind of liked that, and so I put that with their rhythm, and suddenly it was like, hey, we're off, you know.
You see, there we are, we're kind of going acoustic, but going more electric. You know, it starts soft, and it builds and builds and builds. By the end, it's just, everything's going, you know, it's as big as any song we've ever done, really, I think. And I guess probably this must be the first time with the bass pedals. Because Trespass was a 5-piece, so you didn't need bass pedals, whereas we'd gone to that 4-piece scenario, with Tony playing the lead parts and me trying to play rhythm guitar parts, and bass pedals at the same time. So in a sense, it's funny how things happen. You get stretched and you're forced into doing something. I'm sure if we hadn't been a four-piece, I'd never have bothered to pick up the bloody bass pedals.
Musical Box obviously was, as I said, developed out of us playing as a four-piece, and I think it also developed out of really right from the early days of the playing with Ant and Mike, and so it had that sort of two-guitar thing, and I play guitar on it as well at the front, so the first part of it is all guitar, and we sort of, a few ideas came out of that. But I think the real strength of the song comes towards the end, really. There's a little sort of a bit that starts, She's a Lady, and then the organ comes in playing this little sort of fugue type thing, which I originally saw as instrumental, I have to say. I thought, this is really good, you know, and then we did it. And then Pete suddenly, we were doing the vocals, and I said, oh, so he's finished now, you know, and then suddenly he started singing on this bit, and I thought, shit, he's singing all over my bit. And I must admit, initially I wasn't too sure about doing that at all. And in fact, when we did the mix of the album, we mixed the voice too low. But on stage when we started playing this, I realised just how strong that was, you know. Because it was like what I played was still there in a sense, but the vocal just gave it that real sort of capping quality, I think, and it was a real standout moment on stage, I think.
Well, this was one of the regular battlegrounds, you know, because Tony would, blissfully unaware of an audience, you know, want to stretch things out for 10 or 20 minutes for big keyboard and instrumental things, and I would be thinking, you know, well, we're trying to tell a story here too. We need to re-plug in back with some vocals. So I think there were a lot of arguments about those type of issues, and probably more in latter days too, and sort of Supper's Ready and like Apocalypse and 9/8 and some of the Lamb, because I just felt some of the keyboard solos were just going to get, were too long and going to lose people. So, and it was an important part, because, you know, once you didn't want all the up moments to be instrumental only and all the down moments to be the vocal bits. I certainly didn't.
Sunday at 6 when they closed both the gates, a widowed pair.
The first thing I ever sort of wrote in my own right for Genesis was for Absent Friends, and I think I was too shy to present it to the lead singer. Like, oh, Pete, you know, do you fancy doing this? Because, you know, Pete was very much the star, very open, friendly, approachable, etc. But at the same time, you know, I think maybe the fact that we were the two new boys, Phil and I, we sort of wrote that thing together. We wrote the lyrics together. I came up with the music for it, and it was a pleasant little ditty. The thing is, a lot of people didn't realise that was Phil, because Phil and Pete did have very similar voices. In fact, I remember seeing them live before I joined the band, and I thought there was some sort of automatic double tracking effect going on with Pete's voice, and then as I looked a little closer, I could see that, you know, Pete and Phil were in perfect sync with similar sort of vocal tones.
Steve and I did write this song because we were the two new boys that kind of felt, well, why don't we sort of see what we can do? And the fact that it was on the album, I guess, was because it was very different from anything else, and I think we were quite happy to have that variety.
Any formation of the band has always been like anyone that could do something, could bring something to the table, you know. Singing, playing flute, we encourage it, you know what I mean? Whatever you've got, you use, you know. I think Pete enjoyed having Phil singing it.
It's not my favourite moment, I have to say, but his voice sounds very nice, very pure. You know, he sort of has more of a sort of James Taylor sort of quality in those days, right, before he got this great bit of the rasp that was to come later. But it showed that he had it. I think because he had a nice voice, we thought it would be great to sort of feature it as a solo thing, and that was it. And Pete was quite happy with that, you know. Just showed another side to the group, I think, a little bit, really. And, but as I said, it was more in the contributions, really, where he's singing, you know, with Peter. I think that it's a more of a on Harold the Bower, for example, you know, where they sing the whole thing as a duet, sing it together. In fact, they're actually mixed on the tape. You can't separate them. We thought it might be nice to sort of, you know, because it sounds, you know, sometimes it sounds a little Phil biased, I think, that song.
I'm standing in a doorway on the main square, tension is mounting.
What happens is that my voice, as you can hear now, has got quite a lot of bass content in it, low content, and the lower Phil's, on the other hand, is much sort of higher element, his sort of center of gravity, if you like, harmonically. So if you put the two at exactly the same level, you'll read more of his voice than mine. And even though Harold the Barrel, was all my song, that I think, you do hear just as much of Phil, if not more, in some places. So, I think when I left and that voice continued, that was easier for people to get used to, and I mean, he's a very natural singer, so I think it should have occurred to the others earlier on than it did, I think, to try Phil.
Harold the Barrel was a good fun song. It showed the kind of the humour that we would later, well, has always actually been in Genesis. People tend to take us very seriously, but we don't. So that was a good thing. Phantom of the Sound Masters was a huge stage song.
I had this piece that I'd written when I was at university, which is just this little organ part, really. It was quite a simple little rundown. And I started developing it once. We decided to buy a Mellotron, that was it, because we really wanted, we loved the sound, and we had used a little bit on Trespass, and we loved the first Crimson album, which had used it obviously very extensively. So we went and bought one of the ones off King Crimson, actually. And I sort of, this little riff I'd started off at in university. I then tried it was using the Mellotron and the organ, and it really developed these great big swells on this thing, and it sounded fantastic. And so that was Phantom of Salmacis, and it was that we then developed from that sort of opening part into a complete song out of that, which a lot of jamming from the rest of the group and everything. But it produced a very, I think, a sort of strongly romantic thing, a lyric, obviously, sort of based on the myth of Salmacis.
Conquest, he found himself within a glade he'd not beheld before. Where are you, my father?
What I liked about that was the band had the kind of grand sweep of an orchestra on it. It was using the Mellotron to the full. And I remember one night we were working on the song. It was about midnight, and we'd all had a meal. Normally we didn't do that. We tended to sort of down tools, and once the sun had gone down, that was usually it. But for some reason, we were all up for it, and we were rehearsing in this place in Crowborough, Tony Stratton Smith's cottage there, in a place we nicknamed Toad Hall. And it was midnight, and we were doing what became the end of that song. And I think we were all fairly relaxed after a few, drinks, and right at the end it just seemed like a perfect moment to do a guitar solo over it. So I steamed in with that, and I felt that there were no bands really around that were doing anything quite like that, a sort of fairly classical chord sequence and a rock guitar solo over the front that's maybe got a little bit more to do with the violin in spirit than the guitar. I'd come up with this idea of this guitar technique which was tapping as a 71, and it meant that you could play like a keyboard player by using the fretboard like a keyboard. Tapping's on Hogweed, it's on the front of Hogweed, and tapping's also on the musical box. So it's on both tracks, and also Tony and I used to twin these things together. So the intro of the Return of the Giant Hogweed was the two of us doing those parts in harmonies, triplets in harmonies.
Turn and run, nothing could stop them. All around every river and canal, their power is growing.
Your taste changes over the years with all sorts of things, and but there was a mood which Paul nailed, I think, which although an external scene because of the croquet game and, again, the sort of suppressed violence was, I think, accurate for the vibe that we were trying to portray at the time.
It's certainly weird. It's as crazy as any wallpaper was that was around at the time. But you've got to remember that the 60s had just passed, only just. So I think it very much reflects its time.
I almost prefer this cover coming back to it than I did at the time, in a funny way, looking at it. It's difficult for me to see. It's so much part of my past and youth, and I've signed so many copies of these things that you sort of see them all the time now. So it's rather difficult to have an objective viewpoint. But I think it's a strong image, you know, and with the sort of the lawn stripes and everything. You know, it gives a very strong feeling, and it fits well with the idea of the title and that association with the musical box.
I remember at the time Paul Whitehead coming in with, you know, the idea, and obviously he had worked with Peter on a couple of ideas on the phone, I would imagine. You know, it was before the days of email, so if you wanted to see something, you had to actually get together in a room and look at it, you know. And the thing with the croquet with the heads, you know, that was all very, it's kind of off the wall. I mean, fortunately, it wasn't as romantic and feminine as Trespass, which was good because it showed that there was a little bit of a unusual side, not just a wistful side to the band. Because I think for Trespass, the music and the cover looked a bit wistful, even though there's a knife on it. But you know, it doesn't feel quite as butch as Nursery Cryme.
The flame still summer lingers on, though her pictures soon shine.
Well, Nursery Cryme obviously was the album that incorporated Phil and Steve into the band, and I think that we became, for that reason, perhaps a better playing unit than we've been in the past, really. And we'd also, by this time, played quite a lot on stage, and so I think the development from Trespass was quite a big one. And we had the ability, the mellotron was the new instrument in that album and everything, and so a sort of certain quality of what people came to think of that early Genesis sound was very much, I think, started with this album, probably more than with the previous one.
I was thrilled with it, you know. I mean, the rough edges at that time I refused to hear. I just wanted to sort of bask in the glory of the fact that, you know, I'd done an album with what was destined to become a great band, and occasionally the sound was wonderful.
It was a real great 5-piece working unit, you know. I mean, we all got together for the meetings with the cover, you know, we all got together. We were there all the time for the mixing. Pretty much we were all involved in the writing, apart from the lyrics. You know, certain songs would have pairs going off to write lyrics. But no, it's the period especially. I have very fond memories of the period.
A step into the shade, if you like. There's more sort of sun shining in Trespass, more sort of folky fields and outside stuff, and we've gone indoors, a Nursery Cryme.
I think it's a good example of how we were moving on. It's got some nice stuff and some okay stuff, I think, at Nursery Cryme. Thought the cover was good. I like the cover, actually. Quite a strong image of the little girl on the croquet lawn and the head, I think. And we were starting to create an atmosphere about the band. You know what I mean? Quite as perception, quite slightly quirky. People seeing this artwork, hearing the songs, Pete's performance. I felt we're starting to sort of become something that was a little unique in the music business in England, and that was a good thing, I think.
I think Foxtrot was, we were gaining confidence. You know, live was going very well at that point, even though, you know, financially things weren't good, but there was a great rapport building, and it was beginning to sort of move around other countries, and so I think we were confident in a way that we hadn't been before, and so that gave us the, if you like, mental platform on which to build something like Supper's Ready, which is still one of the things that I like best looking backwards.
I think going to Foxtrot was, well, we were pretty confident in what we'd written and everything. I think it was, we had trouble with engineers and producers on this. I think Charisma were very keen for us to use this guy, Bob Potter, who'd worked with Lindisfarne. And because they wanted us to sound, I don't know what they wanted really, but they wanted the voice louder, I think was what they wanted more than anything else. And they thought a real producer coming in might be something, the sort of thing we had. So we went into the studio with this guy, Bob Potter, and I played, we started recording stuff, and I played the opening to Watch for the Skies. He said, I don't like that. I don't think we should use that. So I thought, oh God, here we go, And so in the end, I said, well, no way. And we tried a couple of other things, and he was, okay as an engineer and everything. It was fine. It was good engineer, actually, nothing wrong with that. But the fact he didn't like what we were doing meant that we couldn't work with him. So we got rid of him and ended up working with just the engineer. And in fact, we changed engineers in the middle of the song because the engineer we were working with weren't too sure about him either. We recorded the first half of Supper's Ready with this other engineer. And then we got this other guy, John Burns, came in as the next engineer, and we finished off the song with him and did the rest of the album with him.
Well, I was fairly shattered at that time, and we'd done a lot of touring, and I think every now and again I would threaten to leave, and so would Phil. And luckily, on day one recording of Foxtrot, Mike and Tony sat me down and said, "We don't want you to leave, Steve. We really like your guitar playing." Now, strange as it seems, I hadn't really understood that at that point. I didn't, because, it was, I think there was this stiff upper lip thing in the band. We didn't sort of compliment each other very much. So I felt very insecure as one of the new boys, and I thought, it's better to leave before I get sacked. But, this was a revelation to me. I think there was lots of great stuff on Foxtrot, so I'm pleased they asked me to stay.
From the way we worked, I guess, was, we were playing all the time, and we would when we weren't playing, we would rehearse, and write, and we try to get blocks of writing time, but I can't remember whether we managed to do much more than a week in Woolwich and a week in even a Billings, or a week in, some of it was done in Chessington. So we had a friend who had a friend who had a house. So we moved in there to do a bit of it, I think. I know certainly Selling England was done there, but we did it all over the place. And we had moved on from Nursery Cryme. We were playing lots of gigs. We were very, very good live by this point. Obviously Steve had come on for the Nursery Cryme, but we were very much a band, a better band.
On the whole, this album is one that, it's probably my favourite of the, as a totality of the early albums, I think. I just think it's got sort of, we really came of age of this album, I think, and it got to number 12 on the charts, which was a staggering thing for us. So we were quite excited by that.
In my mind, this is a much stronger album than Nursery Cryme, than the first one. I think it's, obviously Summer's Ready is a huge piece, which we'll get onto. I think it was one of our best moments, but I think generally it opens with that Watches the Sky sound, which I remember hearing Tony playing those chords sometimes on an Italian tour, one of these big sort of palace sports with echoes booming around. It sounded fantastic. The band's getting some darkness, I think, more so into the music. I look back and Watches the Sky. It's got a fantastic intro. The rhythm's great. I think the words are a bit suspect. They're kind of okay. Tony and I wrote them. But looking back, it's a little too busy. But I think that rhythm, bum-ba-da-bum-bum-bum-bum, was a nice sort of great groove under those chords.
Sadly now your thoughts turn to the stars. Where you've gone, you never can go.
Watcher of the Skies was a very important track to us, and although I think Tony was the sort of lead writer on that, with particularly the mellotron chords, and I did some work, I think, on the verses and chorus, but the vibe was sci-fi meets prog, I think.
Seems funny to say it now, but I was still going to see Yes every Wednesday at the Marquee, and still trying to bring a little bit of that musicianship into the band, that they kind of tricky arrangements that they used to have, and I used to. So it's a shame we can't do stuff like that. So I think Watch of the Skies ended up. Certainly the intro was all Tony, of course, but that's that was kind of probably came from somewhere near my drum end.
I remember writing it with Tony Banks sitting on a roof initially. Outside a hotel bedroom window, there was a sort of tile roof, sitting there and looking at it, and there was no one around, sort of thing, sort of lunar landscape. It's not good to criticise things, which I often do, because these are period pieces, and as the years go by, I think I've learnt to, you can't just use the words you want to say, they've got to sing well. And these are interesting words, but they didn't sing very well. Watch Your Sky, Watch Your All, it's a stiff lyric. But a good musical song, yeah.
Walking across the sitting room, I turn the television off.
We always started each album, I did, with a degree of trepidation and excitement. A bit like, well, this is the new one, let's see what we got here, but I don't know, a bit like, will it be good, will it work, But I think albums in Mama seem to alternate. Nursery Cryme, I think, was a bit hard to write for me. Foxtrot was easy.
I think we were writing better together as a group. I mean, a lot of the stuff, individual, stuff was still there. You'd come into the group. I mean, I tend to remember on this album, you'd come in with ideas, a riff or something. And like I mentioned at the beginning of Supper's Ready, but also that applies to, what became the end section of Supper's Ready. It was another thing I'd written. In fact, the thing I'd written on guitar at university, as it turned out, the As Sure as Eggs is Eggs thing. And so you had these sort of quite specific bits, like Willow Farmers, Peters and things, and we had these quite big just chunks that were all written by people. Kind of put them all in the same song, and then it was the kind of filling out stuff that almost ended up being the strongest stuff, though. Like the Apocalypse part, which was something that really was Mike, Phil, and I just wrote that, improvising, working out a big keyboard solo together, and the sort of way of playing it. So yes, I think we were writing well as a group together. And then the individual bits that came in, we just developed them more. I was very free with them. Sometimes, in the early days, perhaps, with the song Timetable, for example, I came in with a complete piece and just said, right, this is it, and we did it. Whereas something like Get 'Em Up by Friday, I just had this riff, this dang, 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 dang thing, and played it to them, and then we sort of developed it as a group. And that was sort of, in a sense, was more interesting, I think, and that's why, So I think it both ways work, but I think they're slightly more interesting when the group can all feel they're involved in the composition. It tends to produce a better result.
I think Supper's Ready was, again, one of these journey songs where we really tried to take people along this dream journey. And when it worked and we got to the sort of New Jerusalem stuff at the end, you could really feel people, you were touching people in quite a deep way. And it was, there was a guy who'd been Edith Piaf's promoter in Paris, I remember. When he heard Supper's Ready for the first time, he invited us to perform it at his church in Normandy. And this was a guy who didn't normally relate to rock music. It was more the sort of Piaf era and tradition. And there were things like that were sort of growing in the music, that sometimes you get a feeling and get an area that you could harvest in different ways, and I think capture people's imagination.
We weren't quite sure what we'd written, really, until we heard it back, because we'd sort of heard this long thing. We decided we were really going to go for the long one this time, because we'd done Musical Box and Stagnation. I thought, well, let's just go for one whole side of an album, 26 minutes, and see what we can do. And we got these ideas, and we actually sort of put bits and pieces in the thing. I mean, this song had started off just like Stagnation, really, in a way. I had this guitar piece I'd written, which I thought was a really strong opening part, which was kind of the first 2 or 3 minutes of the song was based on this this part. And we started doing a thing on it, and got the sort of melody and everything. It was sounding really good, and we're carrying on. And it was developing, it was doing little tinkly bits after that, and all the rest of it, and a few vocal bits. And I thought, that if we do this, could just be ending up sounding exactly like Musical Box. We're not careful, So I said, well, let's just stop the song. We had a really romantic bit. I said, let's just stop the song now and go straight into this other piece we have, which is Willow Farm, which is the thing that Peter had written. So let's just go in there. You've got this really pretty bit, and it's really ugly chord sequence suddenly coming in after that. Should sound great. And so we did that, and then that suddenly took the whole song to another dimension. Suddenly the drums were in, everything was going, and the second half of the song becomes very electric, and and I think produced what was our best piece of composition during the period with Peter, which was the latter part of Supper's Ready, particularly from the Apocalypse in 9/8 onwards. It was just, and it was a coincidence to some extent what happened there again. It was another of those places where I had this a keyboard solo, and it ended on these big chords, and I thought, yeah, just big chords, I had this idea of just sort of vocal harmonies going, and then again Peter started singing on top of it, and I thought, oh shit, here he goes again, and I thought, when I heard it back, it really didn't take me very long this time. I thought, that sounds fantastic, and it really was the real peak, you sort of had this long build up with this keyboard solo. Which sort of like starts very sweet and then gets slightly more sinister, and then suddenly this big chord comes in, and then 666 comes in like that. Incredibly strong moment, I think. And I think for the early fans, it was the big moment. And on stage, it was tremendous. It was a really, really strong moment, I think. And Supper's Ready was, it needed all the extra stuff at the front. It's like foreplay. You had to have all that stuff at the front to get to that one moment, I think. And then from then on, it kind of really delivers. So it was, I was very proud of that. When we first heard it back, having written it and recorded it, we hadn't heard it all back. We actually stuck it together. And Mike and I going to another studio because we ran out of studio time, and actually sticking these two parts together, which incidentally actually was slightly out of tune, so we had to do this sort of funny little slowed down the track in order to make it work, which we were able to rectify this on the remixes, obviously. And just hearing it back all as one thing, I thought, this is fantastic. This is so much the best thing we've ever done. I'm really excited by this. So that was a very strong moment. Funny because it's not kind of quoted as much as it used to be. I mean, back in the 70s, I remember they used to have these sort of polls. I remember on it was Nicky Horn's show on Capital Radio, and the number one sort of rock track of all time was Stairway to Heaven, inevitably, I suppose. But number two is Supper's Ready. Well, that wouldn't happen now. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because Supper's Ready never gets played because it's too long. No radio station is going to play a song that's 26 minutes long, is it really? So that applies even in England. So it's kind of, it's not really known about much by people apart from people who know the group and like the group, and who bought the album, I suppose, and the live shows that we did with it. So it's a little bit forgotten, but I think it was a very strong moment. We were always tempted to try and do it on stage, but it is 26 minutes of a show, and that's an awful lot to give over to one piece from that period.
The big stuff on Supper's Ready, like the big instrumental stuff, I remember we were rehearsing at Una Billings School of Dance in Shepherd's Bush, and I had something to do in the afternoon, and I came back, and Mike and Tony had written basically the Apocalypse in 9/8, and that's what it ended up being called. This was just this riff, don't, and I said, that sounds good. And Tony had written, not thinking about the time signature, he'd sort of written this keyboard thing, and actually the thing was in 9/8. So I maybe played it once or twice, but never really thought about it too much. And of course, we went in to record it, still not really knowing what it was, but it was just like one of those moments where the tape was playing and recording, and it was just captured. That's one of our best, probably one of our best spontaneous moments. I still listen to that and can't quite work out, how it just all happened at the right time. So. And also the last bit, New Jerusalem, I think that's fantastic. So that's probably my favourite song on that.
It's funny, looking back, the way it happened, it was never like you knew what you were doing. You know what I mean? We had a whole lot of bits, and then we still start stringing them together. And it's the first time it happened like this, the second half, the sort of keyboard solo to the end, was really, it showed a bit more of a freedom. You know what I mean? The keyboard solo was just really myself, Phil, and Tony and Steve just sort of jamming, and Tony writing stuff over that riff we're just playing all the time down the bottom with no movement, so he can move around the chords a lot. But the moment when we built to that 666 bit, it was one of those few moments in your career where you actually got a great sounding thing, and Pete came in with it's a vocal line we hadn't sung together. He laid it on top. You hadn't been rehearsing it like that, right? I mean, he just came in, we imagined there was some singing there, or maybe not, and it sounded fantastic. I likened it to Mama. I think the middle eight of Mama and this bit have got similar things where just it's really one of those moments in your career where you go in and Peter first of all and Phil later had laid this vocal down. It's just like fantastic, so strong. So it shows a bit more freedom, because we tend to write songs much more compact, lots of bits in it, whereas this was a bit freer. You'd stay on a section for a bit longer and let things happen.
He's writing the lyrics of a brand new tune.
What I've always loved about this business as a writer, and you learn it as you go along, is that there's luck. I mean, luck does come into it. And things that seem quite effortless, as this was, are always good. We weren't aware when we put it all together that we had a really strong thing. Thought it was good. But things that happen without the feeling of trying are often the best things, I think. And I think someone really had that sort of feeling about it.
I think we were beginning to know who we were as writers, and also know how to deliver it as performers. Whereas I think, it's a coming of age piece, I think, in lots of ways.
It functioned like the introduction to Supper's Ready because it just went straight into Supper's Ready, so people just assumed it was part of Supper's Ready. That's fine, but it was 1 minute 30 seconds of me coming up with something that was based on a Bach prelude, I think it was for cello, and I was amazed that the guys let me put it on the album. To be honest, I remember playing it to them in rehearsal one day, and Phil said, "It sounds like there ought to be applause at the end of it." So I'm thank you, Phil, for that. Because otherwise perhaps it wouldn't have made it onto the album. It's very nice, it's slightly sort of, I was thinking along the lines of Tudor composers like William Byrd, writing short pieces like the Earl of Salisbury, very short pieces, 1 minute 30 seconds, perfectly good enough for a Tudor composer, but for rock and roll, in those days nobody told you that you couldn't.
Get 'em out by Friday. You don't get paid till the last one's well on his way.
Get 'Em Out by Friday was a song essentially about people being kicked out of rented accommodation. So there was, I think, some of the Rackman stories of sort of bad landlords and that sort of thing. And I put in a little extra thought there about evolving the species to shrink people, so that with genetic engineering you might make people a lot shorter, which would mean you could get many more apartments in the same building. And it was done, as a sort of slight comment on attitudes of landlords to tenants. But there is actually, I think, a reasonable argument that when we are fully controlling our evolution genetically, which I think we will be, maybe not in my lifetime, but in my children's lifetime, there may be a decision to go smaller. I mean, that's one way of using less of nature's resources in all sorts of areas. So, get short might be a slogan of the future. Part social comment, part prophetic.
Get 'Em Out Friday is a good song, I think, actually. A little example of where, a great lyric, nice idea. An example of where something we did suffer from. We had too much stuff on a song. You know what I mean? The track was great without any vocals. sounded good, but in fact, when the vocals came on, there's a very clever lyric and a great performance from Peter. It's almost too much in there. As the years tick by later on, 10 years down the line, we started to realise that there's a danger in actually not getting the voice early on when you're actually playing tracks, because in a sense, sometimes in those days we'd often do that track instrumentally. People go away, come back with the lyric sometimes and vocal ideas, and hadn't sung much beforehand. Whereas, sometimes in the later songs you can just play the chord of A for 8 bars, which instrumentally sounds a bit boring. When there's a great vocal on top, it really works. So we sort of had more space later on to let the voice do its thing. And this song suffered a bit from having just too many good ideas in it.
Because there was nothing to sing at the time, Peter wouldn't necessarily sing. He'd be playing his bass drum, he'd be playing his tambourine, he'd be playing a flute, shouting something, singing something. We couldn't hear it because it was in a rehearsal room, not very good PA. And we'd get these great things that actually sounded like instrumental things. And then he would go away and come back with a lyric. And it would it'd be so crowded, so dense, and the idea was great, because this was the idea of running short of space and property. So let's try and get people to become smaller. I think it was kind of roughly the gist. But no, we did find that the downside to the way we were writing and the kind of just the technical hearing a voice at that stage meant that we would write these things and they would come back a little busy, a little dense, by which time it was too late. Because sometimes we'd recorded the backing tracks, and then we'd say, okay, well, you go and write the lyrics for that, you go and write lyrics for that, and then the lyrics would come back, and we'd put a vocal on, and it was like, sometimes.
The second best song is definitely Get 'Em Out by Friday for me on this album. I mean, I think that's a much better song than Watch with the Sky. So the introduction is a sort of, is a kind of a bit of an iconic sort of piece, I suppose, with Genesis. But it's, people forget about the other ones. I mean, but I don't know. I know a lot of people who think Can You Stood It in the Coastline is one of their favourite tracks, So I think I think every piece on this worked pretty well. It's strong. I mean, the end section of Can You Stood It is really good. I think it's sort of, the first part's good. It's a really good song. And then it's just a bit fragmented, that song, I think. That's where it suffers slightly. But the last part is a good instrumental piece as well. So, I just said before, I feel this album is strong all the way through.
Skimming by as eyes of the past.
I was less happy with this sleeve than I was with the first two. I think the style was losing some of its appeal to me, even though the Fox character, I think worked. And then I'd had this sort of Fox idea of really, which was related to, I think, hunting and the hunted, and I was looking at all sorts of esoteric stuff, and numerology was one of the things that when I wrote out the letters, each letter carries a certain value, and A, B, C, D, E, F, and then next time you come round you get to O, and then you get to X, all of which are under the number 6. So then there was the Revelation references and 666 and all that crap. So there was a sort of hidden element to it, which we were just playing around with, really. And it wasn't the backwards playing, devil worshipping version, but this mixture of sort of Christian and pagan symbolism was, I think, part of that journey.
When I first saw it, I thought, I wasn't sure about it, to be honest. If I'm honest, it looked rather like a kind of collage of unlikely things. It looked like a number of cutouts. Since then, I've come to understand the concept of collage a little more, and I think it works. But at the time, I thought this is just strange, and does it work? And it had this sort of flat, one-dimensional sort of look because it was collage, I suspect.
Well, I thought this was the weakest of the album covers he did, certainly at the time. I mean, you come back to it now, again, it's rather difficult to sort of to view it as a sort of, objectively. I don't... The sort of the mockery of the hunt sort of thing, I've seen a bit of a cliche and everything. I didn't sort of thing, and it was sort of his idea to kind of do it, to do what he did. And it doesn't really relate to anything on the album, So it was all a bit of a thing. But we managed to make it kind of make sense by giving the album the title Foxtrot. Sort of helped to kind of. To rationalise a little bit. But I don't think we were terribly happy with it, to be honest. It was just one of those things that, as a group, we weren't that happy with. I know a lot of other people think it's good, but not so much for me.
Lovely atmosphere on Trespass and Nursery Cryme. They felt like paintings and had a nice texture. This felt a little bit... It was okay, but he just put together a bunch of images that were in the lyrics, in a sense. I think it didn't do it for me. I think it was a bit weak. And I guess that's why we changed the next one, I think, actually, time to move on, in a sense.
For me, it was like getting a little bit busy. And I guess that was one of the reasons why we felt, we didn't know that then, but that was the last one that Paul did for us. Because I just felt that, Trespass did have an elegance about it, and Nursery Cryme had more, more butch. But this was just a bit busy, it looked like it didn't look professional for some reason. The fox's head lady, or a figure anyway, on a bit of ice, is it? And water, it's all a bit dated now. But it does sum up the album, the period. You just straight away you're there. But what do I think? What did I think of it? I thought it was okay, but not particularly special.
I used to wear this UV makeup and bat wings, but it would start the show, and in darkness, the UV lights would slowly come on, and these big droning chords would appear out of nowhere, and then you'd see these two little points of light, which would be the eyes lit up, and we had a white backcloth at that time.
Well, Peter had started, as I said before, really trying to find things to do on stage, and it's developed into wearing these kind of, the masks and everything, which on Suppers really worked really well. The flower idea was, at the time it seemed a bit crass, but it just worked so well, As I said, it happened at that point I was talking about in Suppers Ready, where the music went from pretty to silly, and he just sort of suddenly said a flower and stuck this thing on his face, and it was a great musical moment.
A flower?
If you go down to Willow Farm.
Paul Conroy, who was working with us as an agent, and apparently I think Glenn Coulson, were talking about ways of trying to market this record, and I think Paul got the music, but it wasn't really Glenn's cup of tea at all. But when they saw the cover and saw this fox character, they thought, oh, maybe we should, pay someone a few quid and have them wear a fox head. And then I thought, well, actually, if we're going to do that, I should try doing that. So I took a red dress from my wife's wardrobe, she told me since it was an Ossie Clark dress, it would probably be worth quite a lot now, and I could just about get into it. I put the fox head on, and the first gig was actually in this old boxing ring in Dublin, which, while now being a very progressive, tolerant, open city at that point, there was a shocked silence when I walked out on stage. Seeing a man in a dress and in a sort of animal head there was a visceral sense of shock that you could feel, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, we'll do that a bit more.
Pete probably very clearly realised that if he tried to run it by the band and get a committee vote on it, we'd all have said, you've got to be kidding, So he cleverly appeared on stage with a red dress and a fox's head. And we all kind of just went, wow.
There was a ton of arguments about it, and I thought, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. Because we were always doing this sort of band democracy stuff, and actually it wasn't a real democracy because some people were more powerful than others. And the more bloody-minded of us tended to get their way more often, and as it is in every band the world over.
We realised, I mean, the story is that, we did it and we weren't sure about it. We were happy enough with it in a way, but the next week he was on the front page of Melody Maker, so we thought, this is interesting.
And at that point, the band said, oh, maybe Peter has something. Perhaps we shouldn't fight him on all of this, because they definitely got front page good.
People often think it was the other way around, that the sort of he was depicted on the cover, but of course he just dressed up, which is funny in a way, because we weren't too sure about that album cover, so, but it sort of made sense when he did it, suddenly he dressed up, turning up like that. And I can't remember exactly what I thought at the time, really. I mean, it was probably didn't approve to begin with, but then got used to the idea.
Hey, my baby, don't you know our love is true?
Foxtrot always appears to me to have an album where things took us by surprise, as in Summer's Ready, and the end section, And later on in our career, that happened a lot more. But in those days, there were 5 of us full of ideas. It was a little bit of a sort of almost too many ideas going around. So bits like this, where things could just happen a bit freer, I think were great.
Well, Foxtrot was the first album to sort of, I think, where we kind of sounded sort of convincing to the outside world. I think we sort of convinced ourselves with the first 2 albums, and convinced maybe our fans. And I thought the next Summer's Ready just took it on slightly another level, that people could hear this album who had never heard Genesis before and be interested in it. And I think that was a significant moment. And it was, as I said, it was a minor hit. I mean, it wasn't a big hit, but it certainly was sold a lot more than its predecessors had.
I would summarise the period as a band trying to find its feet, hoping that the record company were going to renew their contract each album, and we were being given the thumbs up to develop very, very slowly, thanks to Tony Stratton-Smith, who was a wonderful man who signed acts who he felt passionately about, and he would give them and us many, many albums to make it. It was a very slow burn in those days. It was, there was nothing meteoric about the rise of Genesis.
I was definitely getting to feel like a band, and I think Phil was certainly beginning to get more comfortable in terms of expressing himself musically, and Steve would be sort of would assert himself, but I mean, still slightly tentatively. I think, there was always a holding back element with Steve when I was there, and I think that loosened up, when he went from glasses to contact lenses.
I have very fond memories. We did most of it at Island Studios in Basing Street, and John Burns was the engineer, kind of helped us. And, hearing those things and hearing Summer's Ready put together, and it was very strong, We were actually getting somewhere, and here we had a great album. And this album, when it came out, did better than the one before. So it was all, power to the people.
Can you tell me where my country lies? Said the unicorn to his true love's eyes.
One of the aims of the record was to sort of look at Englishness in a different way, and therefore this title, Selling England by the Pound, seemed to be a good title for the album. So I made my recommendation.
I think one of our best titles ever, actually, Selling Them by the Pound, is a great phrase. Peter on stage with that headgear thing looking a bit like something on the back of a coin. It was a great sort of setting for the song. I think the first part of the song was great. I think the Moon at Night bit was okay, a bit busy. But I think one of our best album titles, actually.
As far as I remember, Selling England was a relatively happy, calm period in the band's history.
We used to have writing sessions. We didn't necessarily write sort of all in one go, but quite a lot of Selling England was written in one place. And I remember funnily enough, on this particular record, we were a bit stuck for ideas. We had 2 or 3 things that we knew we had. There was this riff that Steve had been playing on stage and all over the place, which we all thought was really good. And we knew we wanted to do something with that. And we developed that into the song I Know What I Like. And it was a quite simple thing, which was quite good for us, really. But we just thought it had a very strong atmosphere. So there's that. And then I had these 3 bits I'd written, which I was originally assumed would go into different songs. But I think probably because the others sort of wanted my stuff sort of a kind of a Banks ghetto, they all ended up in the same song, which ended up being Firth the Fifth. And I really just strung the 3 bits together and made sense of them in a way to make them good. And so those were written, and then we wrote this sort of riff that became the first part of Battling Epping Forest. Other than that, we didn't really have much else. It was kind of like we were struggling a bit for finding things. So we ended up playing these 3 things sort of every day for a long time, and kind of overworked, particularly Epping Forest. I think we overworked it.
There was all this emphasis on writing songs, and I hadn't really written any songs for the album at that point. There were things that were going on in my private life that made it almost impossible to do that. And so really I just had lots of guitar licks, and I used them all on the album. That was the thing. And in some ways that was perfect. It meant that the album took on a more fusion sort of feel, and it was a little bit closer to Mahavishnu Orchestra. There was some tapping, there was some sticking it through a Leslie cabinet, there was that influence. It was a little bit Beatley, it was a little bit that, but it was still very English. And so I had a great time just being the guitarist, not wondering about, not trying to be a songwriter. I think I only came up with one thing as a song, which was After the Ordeal, which started out as this electric thing. I think it plainly didn't work as an electric melody. No one could make it swing. Ended up being this kind of acoustic thing that had a electric bit on the end. But I remember doing this in Chessington. We were in this house in Chessington, and as ever, it was eccentric as ever, I think. For some reason, we were in the living room of a house, and of course it wasn't soundproof, and of course neighbours started to complain, and but nonetheless, the fact that it was slightly out of town, it was slightly quirky, it was slightly strange, it had that homegrown feel about it.
There's a fat old lady outside the saloon, laying out the credit card she plays for two.
Some people see this as a difficult album to make. I wouldn't particularly remember it as being difficult, but I do remember the Chessington sessions when we kind of came up with a cinema show. And then we danced with the Moonlit Night. I was starting to listen to Mahavishnu Orchestra, so I was trying to put my weirdness, my weird time signatures, and into anything that would move, anything that would allow me. So Dancing with the Moonlit Night was, I think, probably some of the instrumental stuff was me and Steve there. I Know What I Like, of course. That was at Una Billings, and we wrote that. And that was us doing our Beatle thing, really, which we didn't see any harm in, because we had yet to have a hit single, so nobody else minded either. But of course, as soon as we had a hit single, that's when they started to mind about us having hit singles. I'd Have Plenty, which I think I know Tony's said that kind of he could have done without it. I don't remember it. Firth the Fifth, which is a big tour de force. Cinema Show is a huge tour de force. So I think it's, it's certainly got a lot of what things we still play. Huge stage classics on it. I like Cinema Show particularly. I thought the first half was great as well, and we were staying a little bit better in the studio.
This album was sort of commercially, it sort of came in at number 3 or something. I think I Know What I Like did help. It was a sort of very minor hit. It did sort of get played on the radio a bit and everything. So I think suddenly, but I think also what had happened was that with the live performance, we were picking up fans all the time. And so when the next album came out, suddenly a lot of people went out and bought it all at the same moment, which gave you a bit of chart presence. And we always went down. The second week was always sort of like 3, and then suddenly it was down to sort of 25. But it made you feel that you sort of got somewhere.
I love the album. It's completely bonkers from beginning to end. You've got Pete doing this kind of Scottish plain song thing at the front, this a cappella thing, which then goes into the strangest the strangest atmosphere, and it retains that strange atmosphere right through to the end. And I know that, or I believe that Mike and Tony are not as fond of that album, but I felt we'd made this sort of leap forward as players. We were doing stuff that was difficult to play and using techniques that no one else was employing. So this was very good. And Tony had just gotten the voice tapes on the Mellotron, so we had that choral thing as well. We were able to do that. So we could sound like an orchestra, we could sound like a choir. And I also think that when we were touring America, the fact that we were purporting to sell England by the pound, it made us all things quintessentially English. So all the Anglophiles turned out for that. And American audiences, of course, they were divided. Not all of them loved this, but sufficient of them did. And I think it was by the time we hit Los Angeles and we were doing a series of Christmas concerts that I really felt the band was absolutely at its best. And I felt that I was playing guitar in, the world's best band at that point. I really felt that.
We had a following, we had a proper following. It's a cult following, but a proper following. We could play theatres, do a little tour. I think I seem to remember that. We were sort of starting to become a band with an identity.
It was stable. I mean, it felt stable too. I mean, Phil and Steve had very much sort of found their feet within the group, I think, both particularly as players, and even Steve is a little bit starting as a writer, although it was still quite early days for him, really. So it was a more integrated sort of thing. It was, still probably, I mean, in all honesty, it probably was still the senior and junior members, but that was sort of to slowly change as time went by.
I think very often people would come in with ideas that were starting points, and then they would sort of get to be the captain of that song, if you like. And some things were emerging in band rehearsal. So it was a sort of dual approach.
Obviously, apart from the Firth of Fifth, really, most of the other things were things that were emerged in the studio to a large extent, and the development I know I'd like was very much in the studio. I think we liked. I mean, we always felt that sort of the strongest moments seemed to some reason or other come out of us all improvising and jamming and just sort of things coalescing. Really, we always liked that very much, and that's what gives you the thrill as well. You're playing along and seeing what might happen. But this obviously, from my own personal point of view, was the first time I'd ever used a synthesizer as well. So it was quite a big move for me to have this instrument, this Art Pro Soloist thing, which was quite a very simple monophonic synthesizer, but it had quite a nice little range of tones on it. And it was one you didn't have to sort of do any programming, it just was preset sounds, which was nice for me. And obviously the Cinema Show is very much based on that. But I used it throughout the album on little bits and pieces, and it was a really interesting addition to the sort of armoury, having got also these days I was also organ, piano and mellotron. But to have something alternative to play lead on like this, was suddenly opened up possibilities for me. And these little spring keyboard these things had as well, it was very easy to play. It was it certainly opened up my playing possibilities. I used to try and do everything I could with the Hammond organ. I mean, I'd sort of, you put it through fuzz boxes, wah boxes, switch it on and off. You try using one drawbar, one, or just the percussion sound. You try to get every little thing you get out of it. So you're using 100% of the instrument, is the way I was looking at it. Whereas now with a modern synthesizer, if you use kind of, 1/2 of 1%, you're doing well, I think, because they can do so much. A lot of people just switch on and use presets, and that's all they ever do. So it was. It really opened up the possibilities. I mean, the mellotrons were great to an extent, in the sense that they gave you these lovely string sounds and voice sounds and everything, but you couldn't play fast on them or anything. They were just big banks. They were such a crude instrument that when the synthesizers came in, it just opened up the keyboard world so much.
There's always been Ethel. Chicken, wake up, we got to tidy your room now.
Although it may have looked as if, there was more of a pop sensibility on this record, I think sort of Know What I Like was in part an accident. Often when we tried to chase things, we failed miserably. And I think we got to learn really that when we were ourselves and allowed things to happen, that we seemed to have more success and resonance with audiences.
I had this guitar riff that went ding dong ding dong ding dong ding dong, and around the time of rehearsing Foxtrot, I remember putting the guitar through Tony's Leslie cabinets, and Phil and I used to jam on this thing, and no one else was that keen. They said it sounds too much like the Beatles. We're not going to do it. Following album, Phil and I are still jamming away on the same thing, playing it like idiots, and the whole band joined in. It became a jam, it became a song, it became a hit. And I remember joking about this to journalists who said, they wanted to hear it, and I said, you should hear our latest hit single, as if it was a done deal, and I was just joking, and then it became a hit, and I was thrilled, of course.
You must understand that the word pop was, we grew up with the Beatles, the best band in the world, and they were pop. This word pop's become something different now. A great song is a great song. Although we were writing not that at all, they were different pieces, And I suppose I know it's one of the first songs we actually were able to sort of take a short, simple idea and develop it, rather than, like we often do, have too many bits in a song, We just took one riff and sort of made it into a song. Which is great. It's sort of a real character piece too, with Pete's lyric too.
I never really loved the chorus, which, of course I like my sections, but I think, that was one of Tony's melody on the da 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 da. And after a while, I got very bored of it. But it was fun playing the sort of jerkier and jumpier melodies of the verse, and doing that with Phil, and then getting into this more floaty, simple chorus line.
We were always associated with heavy, progressive group and all that, but we came into the business writing pop songs, and it's something we'd always loved, and we were really pleased we'd actually written one that we thought was pretty good, and probably would have been quite a big hit if it hadn't sort of had this wardrobe in the title, which no one can understand. But it was just a really nice sort of effect, it just developed very well, chorus very strong, and there's some other songs on this which were not quite as. I probably don't have quite so much time for this album as the previous one, purely because I'm not quite so fond of some of the things. After the Ordeal was the track I really don't like. I've never liked it, and I would have liked it not to have been on the album, but it was sort of, in the end, we compromised by putting everything we had on. And there's Dance with the Moon at Night, which I like. I like the way it starts very much, but it's not my favourite song. Although I know a lot of people like it very much, but it's a slightly weaker track for me.
For her merchandise, he traded in his prize.
Dancing with the Moon at Night was this attempt to sort of mix some traditional folk elements with more contemporary band arrangements, and I think even in the colour of the voice I was using at the time, it was folk influence.
I think Dancing with the Moon at Night has got a lot of great moments on it, and when it starts out you really don't know where the song's going to go, do you? And there was this da-da-da-da-dum-bum-bum-bum, which Pete wrote on piano, and mainly becomes a guitar figure throughout the song. Again, it's someone else's melody interpreted on guitar in two different ways. And there's that lovely bit at the end that we used to call Disney, which they started using for some reason on gardening programs these days. Shot of a gnome, and there's this tinkling 12 string saying, that's Mike's bit there, this sort of repeated chord pattern. But we all operated with rock instruments, but not like a rock group. We all sort of faded ourselves in very, very gently, and we're all being very pastoral.
Yeah, I think there was a growing sense of confidence, and also with that particular track, which I started off writing, I was trying to get a folk reference and sort of, if you like, protect and preserve some of the Englishness. So it was in the opening part, particularly trying to capture something that was had more references to Henry VIII than it did to American soul music. And then with the lyric, it was, in a sense, about the commercialization of English culture.
Firth the Fifth is one of those things where Tony just sort of, we'd all get together to play each other our bits, of which he had hundreds, and Mike had quite a few, and Peter had a few, and we'd be steamrolling into playing Firth the Fifth.
Firth the Fifth was, well, obviously it's a kind of like a very strong sort of keyboard moment from the early years, and the way the guitar solo evolved is quite interesting, really, because I'd written, as I say, the three bits, and the second bit I'd written was just really a flute and piano melody, and I'd just seen it as that. And we were playing it, well, we'd played it a few times, it sounded really nice. And then one time Steve said, started playing it, and he started playing it sort of like this, and I thought, oh, great, and I started to put the mellotron in, big chords like this. And it was almost like a joke. We were kind of doing it sort of like a la King Crimson is how we saw it. I was just doing this overblown thing. I thought, that actually sounds really good, this. So we then sort of, so for the reprise of that melody, when it came in the second half of the song, we said, well, let's do it this big way and see how it works. And it worked really well. And it gave a chance for Steve to actually do a sort of proper guitar solo.
Tony's melody, which I tried to interpret in a kind of slightly sort of Middle Eastern sort of way. I was bending all the notes, and I remember one or two people said, "Oh, it sounds a little bit Indian, almost like a sitar," and there was a note that I was able to sustain that would work 9 times out of 10 at the top. You do a high F sharp, and just with proximity to the speaker cabinets, it fed back. So it sounded like I had perfect sustain on every note. I didn't, but I was able to fade in the notes on the beginning of it and sort of wait for it, coast over a sort of atmospheric section, and then play this melody, which I think, although it was written as a piano melody originally, it became a flute melody, and then it became this guitar melody, and it's kind of become Genesis' most well-known guitar solo. So yeah, I was allowed to play forever, it seems, this great long guitar solo in the middle of something written by Tony.
Steve, I think, was starting to really sort of find his feet a bit more on as a player live and everything. I mean, obviously he always contributed, a lot of Genesis music obviously required sort of guitar, sort of acoustic guitar picking and stuff, where people notice it less, I think. People tend to notice lead playing a little bit more, and I suppose on this it was more of a genuine guitar solo. Some of the others are a bit tricksy, who's kind of thinking very hard about every note he played, and so it doesn't sort of soar in quite the way that this does, where I think he allowed himself to actually have a bit more freedom, with it. Particularly before the main melody starts, just some very nice little phrases and stuff, so it sounds more like a real guitarist.
Once again, it's a nice section. It's about more space. We're taking the main theme from the song and just letting it run for about 4 minutes with a lovely guitar solo playing the melody and some lines in between. So we're starting to give sections more space and more time to sit in one mood rather than move on too fast.
Steve definitely, I think, gained in confidence, and Firth of Fifth is very much a Tony piece in terms of its how it started and how it built. But Steve did let loose in, I think, probably the best way up to that point at the end.
Along the forest road, there's hundreds of cars, luxury cars. Each has got its load of convertible bars, cutlery cars, superless cars.
Battle of Epping Forest is a classic example of what I was getting at with Can Utility and Get 'Em Out by Friday, where we had very well recorded as well. I mean, I remember, I can picture this, we were writing it, and we had some really good counter polyrhythmic bits happening, you know. And then Peter took the song and wrote the lyric, and we recorded the track, and then he came in to sing the lyric, and we were just like, it's like 300 words a line, you know. It was like there was no space. Any air had been sucked out of it. And not to say that, you know, he was in the wrong or we were in the wrong. It's just that if we'd have only known, we could have thinned it out. And in those days, we didn't go back and re-record things, you know. This is it. We've got our version. We have to make do, you know. You know, I mean, it's incredible to think about, isn't it, really? But, yeah, so we did play it live, but it was always a little bit, it was always like a barrage of information, you know, sort of being thrown at you. So that was the classic example of when that stuff really got out a little bit out of hand.
Coming over the hill, the boys are building Johnny's legs stand very still.
It's probably too busy, you know. I'd spend a lot of time, you know, building up this story with all these characters and setting scenes, and was quite reluctant to edit as severely as I should have done. So I think it did end up too wordy.
They called me the Reverend when I entered the church on stage.
Even at its weakest, Selling England by the Pound has got great moments on it. Great moments, great humour. Very funny bit in the middle of Epping Forest, Pete doing the vicar. You know, just brilliant.
Home from work, our Juliet clears her morning meal.
The other song on this album, I suppose, that kind of was a big development for us again was the Cinema Show, which was another one of those things that starts off with a sort of quiet, you know, acoustic beginning and then ends up doing something else at the end. But I think the instrumental at the end of this was probably the best of the ones we did at this stage in our careers anyhow. Mike had this riff, which was just in 7, just going dang, 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 like that. And he was playing along. And, you know, I'd sort of just started fiddling around on top of it. And then we thought this could be really good. So again, Phil, Mike and I just went off really and put this all together. And worked on all these bits, and I just improvised for hours and got the little bits and pieces going. And then Mike would change the chords, and we ended up with this piece. And I think it's, you know, it's such a strong rhythm in the first place. A lot of the things you play on it could be really good, but I got 1 or 2 quite good melodies on top of it, and it again built up to a very nice sort of climax, I think, and probably better on stage than it was on the album in many ways. But it was on the album it sort of fades out into the next bit, which I'm not too sure is quite so good, but it's. It was an exciting thing to have created at the time. I think we were very pleased with it.
Cinema Show was lyrically, I think, Tony and Peter. I think. It was either Tony and Peter or Mike and Peter. But anyway, and the end, of course, was just based on a guitar riff, dun, 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 you know, a 7/8 drum riff. And then Tony just sort of had lots of bits on top, and eventually that became the themes, which are a very strong theme.
I think I was influenced, my playing on that, and there's not that much electric playing of mine. I was influenced by the flute work of Ian MacDonald working with King Crimson, so I tried to play very pastoral phrases. I developed it a bit more when we did it live, doing percussion noises and what have you. But in some ways it typifies the Genesis sound because you've got almost a plethora of 12 strings going. Sometimes, you know, 2 12 strings, sometimes 3, and an electric 6 string as well. And this jangly sound where you can't tell, it sounds almost, is that a keyboard? Is that a guitar? What is that sound?
The first part's again another example of when I tuned my 12 strings. And normally you have got 12 strings and they're paired up, and you tune each pair to the same note. I started tuning each pair to harmony notes, which is how the song starts with that sort of rundown. Now, what the hell the tuning is, I haven't got a clue, because the other day in New York we said, well, they were saying, let's do the first half of Cinema Show maybe, you know. And I said, well, all right, but I had no idea how I played it, you know, we'd have to work a compromised version out. But the second part, once again, it seems to be, we started this move really, I think, with myself, Phil and Tony. And what I was doing, Steve, it's more about myself, Phil and Tony, playing... jamming and getting these instrumental moments, like, you know, the back end of the 9/8 in So I Was Ready, this one, which became a large part of our sort of our trademark really. And it was the instrumental part was a huge sort of crowd pleaser. Great live song.
I thought the cover was absolutely brilliant. Betty Swanwick, the fact that she'd done that picture, she was a member of the Royal Academy, and I think it was the front cover of their catalogue advertising the summer exhibition.
She seemed to have, a good combination of Englishness and yet unraveling or exposing the underbelly. And I went down to see her, and then Tony and Margaret came down, and I think I went the first time on my own, but then they came down together, and she was a wonderful character, and she had a parrot, and she kept on talking to the parrot in the middle of the conversation. You weren't quite sure if you were being addressed or the parrot.
We had tea on her lawn, but what was great was she just put the table was on the lawn like that, and she put sort of the tea on that, and it was everything was sort of sliding down the thing, very strange. And the whole time we were there was this parrot that sat on Peter's shoulder, sort of nibbling his collar. It was kind of a somewhat surreal moment. Anyhow, she was an reasonably old lady. Anyhow, she said she'd love to do it, but she couldn't do anything from scratch in a month, which is what we needed, So we said, well, can you modify the picture that you've got, which is what she did. She just took the picture she'd had and she added a lawnmower to it so that it fitted with the lyrics to I Know What I Like, and put these people behind the things. And it worked really well. And I mean, in many ways, it's the best piece of art we've ever had on the front cover. Whether it's the best cover, I don't know, but it's the best piece of art we've had on a cover.
So Betty Swanwick was a wonderful woman. She was a little bit like Miss Marple or an Agatha Christie character, full of life, very smart and mischievous.
She was a great old lady and sort of nice seeing someone from the other world, not just the music world, someone in the art world who was up for sort of trying something.
For me, I mean, the cover was a great cover, the Betty Swanwick cover. That showed that there had been a change of sorts, and from that kind of very almost schoolboy graphic stuff, which was Foxtrot and Nursery Cryme. In its way, it was done. I kind of felt it was a little schoolboyish. This was kind of something that was kind of elegant, the Betty Swanwick characters, and that stayed with us as well. I mean, it's a good album.
This album, I think we came together much more as players. I think it's the first, we sound convincing as players to a greater extent. In some ways, it was the most of the early albums. I suppose it's the most, it's a bit more technique in there and stuff. I always like to think the technique is just another sort of paintbrush in a way. It's something you can use, and it can be very effective at times. You should never take over. I think with some groups it sort of it takes over. It becomes the technique's the thing. You get a guitarist who can play so fast that you can't stop doing it and everything. And we're very happy to sort of sit down. I'm just very happy to just sit down and hold down chords, which I do a lot of the time. I think that's, and then other times you would go mad, and that sort of. The contrast works, and you just use it, and it illustrates something you want to try and illustrate with the piece of music you're writing. And I think that's interesting. And as you said before, I think Steve's playing on this was really good. Particularly, obviously, the fifth solo was a sort of standout moment, I think, for his time with us.
I do look back on this one with fondness, although I think the others, I suspect Tony and Mike might have felt that the songs weren't as strong on it. I felt that it was an album that was big on atmosphere, very well arranged, very well played, lots of very interesting techniques, and everyone, playing and toying with things, where form was perhaps secondary to the spirit of it. So there's no other album in the world that any other band has made that sounds remotely like that. There is no album that Genesis made that sounds remotely like that. So I love it for its for its eccentricity, its invention, and I was thrilled with it, and I still am.
I always liken Selling England and Nursery Cryme as sort of similar feeling albums in my mind. I think the good bits are good and the bad bits are a bit dodgy, but I think there's some strong bits there, definitely. And of course our first semi-hit single, almost. Who'd have thought?
There were things that I was less happy with than others, and obviously I think you follow your own bits and pieces further through than everybody else's, but it's I think some of them could have been a bit sharper. I mean, for example, I mentioned the chorus of Know What I Like, which didn't last for me as a pleasurable experience, even though it got us a hit. Most of our stuff took a few plays to sort of open up to a listener, but if they got it, it would stick around for quite a long time.
And the rain lies down on Broadway.
It was a strange period, actually. I mean, the Lamb kind of started for me. I can remember driving into Headley Grange. I had Andy, my first wife, with me, and I had Jolie with me. And there was this kind of, it was a bit like going into a Dickens novel, it was like this, windows broken and rats everywhere. There were rats everywhere. Bad Company had used it, and Zeppelin had used it, and they'd recorded the When the Levee Breaks album there. But no one had cleaned up. It was really odd. I mean, this poor woman that owned the house, I don't think she knew what she was letting herself in for. But literally there were rats everywhere. So you'd walk in and you'd be walking down the corridor and 2 or 3 rats would walk past you. They wouldn't scurry away. They just walk past you and stop and look at you. Say, well, yeah, got a problem? And then in the back garden, there was these vines, up the back wall, and you'd see this constant scurry of activity. And I was bringing a daughter into this, where we were going to stay the night. I mean, at night when you went to bed, you could hear the scurrying around it. I mean, the place never slept. So, first of all, we had to clear up, but we never got rid of the rats. I mean, they were always there. And it was kind of weird time.
I remember talking to Robert Plant about this. They worked in the same place. Zepp had worked at Headley Grange. And he said, I'm convinced that place was haunted. I said, me too. I heard the sounds at night. I couldn't get off to sleep. That place was weird.
So we took over the living room to write, and there was another room with a piano, which I guess during the first few weeks of this, there must have been discussions, which I was there for. But I don't remember much about who wrote the lyrics. It was one story, okay. One story, one lyric writer. Which I guess in theory is the way to go. But so what I remember mostly about the Lamb was the 4 of us in the big room, jamming and writing and recording on my Nakamichi, everything, and in the other room, Peter writing lyrics to the things that were already there. Which means that, obviously we did play some stuff all together, but it was like him and us. It seemed, my shutter went off at those moments. That's what I remember.
Concept and lyric were all Peter's, and I have to be honest, and I say that I think the actual story is the weakest thing about the album. I don't think the story is really very gripping. Some of the individual lyrics are wonderful, I think, but the totality just doesn't move me. It doesn't do anything for me, really. It reads a bit like a sort of Kurt Vonnegut novel or something, without perhaps quite as good imagery. And that's always stays with me, really. It doesn't satisfy me. In the way that some of the other albums do. The Supper's Ready concept was a much simpler thing, good and evil, but that worked great, I think. But this one, not so well.
The story is, in a way, it's like a Pilgrim's Progress, but on the streets of New York. So it's a spiritual journey into the soul, and but there's quite a tough world that is feeding the imagery and the starting point. So one of the influences on me was a film called El Topo by Alejandro Jodorowsky, who I invited later to work on the screenplay for The Lamb with me. And this was a rough, visceral, cowboy, spiritual film, and it was unique at the time. Had a really strong cult following, and that was the blend that I was trying to put together in a way that would allow more people to try and travel with me.
I think maybe we decided to do a double album to give ourselves a bit more space, as simple as that. I think, you could do them. And we felt a single album rather constrained you. And I think we had this idea, if I remember, that by making it a much longer timescale to work on music, you could do these little jams, improvisations. It gave us a chance to be a little bit freer with how we were playing, I think.
I think when we started writing, and we seemed to have quite a lot of ideas on The Lamb, we thought it would be the idea of making it a double album concept would be adventurous and would be quite a nice thing to try and do, We had no idea what the concept was going to be or anything, but we felt that the audience our audience would be able to take it, and so we found it quite an exciting idea of things to do. And then obviously we had to set about and think about what was the concept going to be about. And I think at this point, Peter sort of had an idea, and he seemed quite keen to do all the lyrics, which was something which we'd never done before. The lyrics have been very much split throughout the group prior to this time. And we weren't really in favour of this, I mean, to be honest, I think the rest of us, because it felt that it would give the album a sort of one-dimensional quality. And I think lyrically, I mean, for me, it does have that for that reason. And but anyhow, I think perhaps the relationships in the group was getting a little bit more, wasn't quite as easy as it once had been. Probably because Peter was being thrust out as the star in a way. Media would only concentrate on Peter really, which was strange in a group that was sort of as democratic as we were in a way, in the way everything came with music and everything was done. So that was a little bit difficult for us, I think. And obviously during the making of, while we were actually writing this album, Peter actually got an offer to do this film script for William Friedkin, and he decided he was going to do it and went off. And that was in the middle of the writing.
Looks at you once, he understands.
I'd written a story, from having done these introduction stories, which went on the back of the live album. And it was about a woman who began sort of stripping in a tube train and taking off her clothes. Anyway, eventually she strips herself down, and all that's left is this sort of tube of light. And it was something that caught William Friedkin's fancy, because he was Mr. Hot and Happening in Hollywood at the time, because he'd just done Exorcist. And he wanted to use that power to try and reinvent Hollywood and bring in a whole new team of people. And he invited me in as an ideas person, to brainstorm and come up with different concepts in different areas. He'd actually approached Tangerine Dream to do the music. There was a guy called Philippe Drouillet, who was from Heavy Metal magazine. There was an animated designer that he wanted to work on some of the visuals. And to me, it was a very exciting opportunity. Not because it was Hollywood so much, but because I love ideas, I love brainstorming with smart people, and that was suddenly going to be given a vehicle and given a chance to come to life. So I really wanted to do it. And I think even though, Phil has always been a sort of jobbing musician and doing other things, there was from, I think, Tony and to some extent Mike, this feeling, well, I think it was a bit, why should he have all the fun? But it was the sense that, no, we're not happy to make time for you to go off and piss away valuable band time. when you should be committed and turning up at 9 o'clock every morning. And that was a sort of hot, contentious issue.
And so he did leave, because we gave him an ultimatum. You choose Friedkin or you stay with the band. So he went. William Friedkin I didn't want to split the band up. I don't even know if this is going to work. This is just an idea. So Peter comes back. But at that point, of course, we all know that this could happen at any time. My first feeling when Peter left was, okay, well, the vocals get in the way anyway. Let's just do it instrumentally. Yeah, let's just get rid of all the vocals and just do it instrumental. We all like the instrumental bits anyway. So, of course, that was poo-pooed, quite rightly. And Peter came back and we carried on writing. And then we went to Wales, this farm in Wales, to record it with John Burns and a mobile. And that was great fun.
We had our first child, Jill, who was married to at the time. It was, as it is for anyone really, it's suddenly the most important thing in your life by a long way. And we had a disastrous birth. We were all set for sort of natural birth, putting her on the breast. She had an infection which was given to her from an epidural needle, which wasn't clean, so she had a fever, Jill had the fever, cord round her neck, lungs full of gunk, everything was going wrong, and we didn't think she was going to survive. They put her in an incubator, carried her away like a piece of chicken carcass wrapped up in silver paper, and they actually wouldn't let my wife see her because they thought it would be cruel for her to bond with the baby who wasn't going to make it through. Chances were so low. I mean, they wouldn't do that nowadays, but they thought they were being kind. That was then the center of everything, and the band, of course, were recording instead of somewhere reasonably close to London, where we were in St Mary's, Paddington, out in Wales. And I was making these sort of long pilgrimages beforehand, and then I would be based here, and then whenever things looked better, I'd try and zoom back to Wales for the recording. So this was something that the band, I think, would accept now, that they were not very understanding, and I just lost it in lots of ways, because I felt, this is so obviously more important than an album or anything else. This is life and death, and it's the center of my family. That's where I need to be. And there was a lot of resentment about that. So I think the seeds for the beginning of the end were sown at that point.
To be honest, we always, looking back, we were so unsupportive. We were like young into the album, intense, this is what we're doing, And Pete, poor old Pete, having to, deal with a terribly traumatic birth, and touch and go and dramas, we gave no help at all, actually, which must have been hard.
It was very difficult. My marriage was breaking up. It looked as if, we only had half a singer. The level of commitment to the band seemed shaky at that point. So for me, it cast a pall on proceedings. And although I think it's a very inventive album and has got great moments on it, I still feel there was this sense of claustrophobia that accompanied it for me. The idea that we were still trying to employ the philosophy of everyone going away together and living together cheek by jowl, but there were families, there were children. It really wasn't a healthy kind of environment for everybody.
The scent grows richer. He knows he must be near. he finds a long passageway lit by chandelier.
To try and keep everybody happy, there would be parts of it where, we'd be discussing lyrics and throwing some of the words around for different bits. And so the Lamia, which was so Tony's musical piece, or supernatural anaesthetist, was Steve had brought in. So then, they would discuss some of the lyrical stuff with me because they'd sort of got the writer's ticket. But, I was pretty anal about hanging on to some lyrical flow through and, being able to put a stamp on it. I really wanted a sort of tougher edge to this record than we'd had previously. And I didn't think there was anyone else in the band that was going to deliver that.
Struck by beauty, gripped in fright. 3 vermilion snakes of female face, the smallest motion filled with grace.
I think the sound on the Lamb is better. It was slightly more like they were recording us live. I said earlier that we always felt like the live sound was good, and on record it was a bit of a struggle to get it back good enough as it was in the room. We recorded in a room, and I think that made it feel. The drums had more of a live feel, and I think that the sound improved a lot. I mean, there's some good sound on this album, I think, because of the idea of not being in the studio, being in a live room, and sort of miking that more like we're sort of playing together on stage. So I think the sound was quite an improvement for us, yeah.
Some of those tracks sound even a bit like Neil Young, the kind of the barn recordings of Neil Young with Crazy Horse, that you can. It's just, it has that kind of, not a studio, not soundproof, but very woody quality. So
coming back to it and doing the remixes and everything, what's actually on the tapes is really good, and to be honest, the original mix isn't bad either, I don't think, on this album. There's less change on this than, say, on the previous records, which is quite a bit of changing going on. I mean, you can still do a lot with it, a lot of moments you can really have fun with. And, things like with the 5.1, you can sort of, the different characters, like on Slipper Men, you sort of voices out the back and things, which is quite nice. There's disconcerting things like that happening. So we tried quite hard to make it a sort of interesting 5.1 mix as well as the new stereo. So it works pretty well.
Rock face moves to press my skin. White liquid turns sour within. Turn fast, turn sour.
It was a dark time, I think, and so it felt as if we were sort of still living that dream of isolating ourselves and being in a sort of supposedly nurturing creative environment, but it wasn't working on lots of different levels yet. I think still some of our best material of the period when I was there in The Lamb Lies Down, and that's still one of the things looking back that I feel proud of. So there is, I think, quite often this irony when you get really shitty things going on in life, and yet the creativity that comes out of it can still be strong, interesting, and move people.
We just had more space on this album because of the double album. I know it sounds very simple to say it, but that meant you could actually breathe a bit, not rush from section to section. And of course we took it live, played America, before the album was out. So we're playing the whole show, a new album that's not out, concept double album. And thinking about it, it was madness really, but actually it went down okay.
In terms of songs, I always think of The Lamb Lies Down itself being the sort of last song that Peter and I kind of ever wrote together, because we'd written a lot in the early days together and things. And it was a pretty good song to end on, really. But the rest of the album, sort of, as I said, it was kind of, I don't know what it is, something about it. I think the lyrics, although they're good lyrics, but it means that no song really kind of stands out on its own. What could have been, say, some really pretty song like The Lamia, for example. I mean, if you start singing that out of context, it makes no sense at all. You sort of talk about snakes and stuff. So I slightly resent that aspect of it, I suppose. And the one we obviously, there's two songs we perform quite often out of context from that, which one is In the Cage, which sort of almost works, although the Brother John bit in the middle lyrically doesn't make much sense, but I think it's a really strong piece of music, so it all stands up. And then the other one's The Carpet Crawlers, which works because it's got a chorus that kind of could relate to anything. I mean, the verse lyrics are pretty strange if you listen to them, but they're some lovely imagery in there as well, so I think that works well out of context.
It's not a record company album, that. You know, the record company will come and say, what the fuck is that on there? You've got to get rid of that. There's no singing on that. Get rid of that. You know, so and that was what was wonderful about Stratton Smith. And, you know, he would just try to deal with whatever we gave him. And Atlantic did their best like that too, because Ahmet was a big music person, and, you know, he probably didn't understand anything about The Lamb Lies Down at all. It's just that he could see that it was something adventurous, and he just kind of crossed his fingers and hoped that we weren't mad, you know.
The carpet crawlers, he dare call us. We gotta get him to get out.
Well, Carpet Crawlers, it's difficult to know really. When we wrote it, we actually had a couple of moments in the story that Peter had some action, which we didn't have any music for. So we sort of were sitting in the room, and Mike and I just sort of started just doodling, you know, and played this very simple chord sequence, developed this idea, just the thing, and you know, so that we said, well, there you go, there's a basis, and then Pete wrote this thing on top of it.
And of the melody of that track, because I worked my ass off on that. It was actually I was staying mainly with at Jill's parents' place, which was in Kensington, and there was an old out-of-tune piano, but I spent hours and hours honing that melody in, and then the lyric.
Worked really well. It's one of those things, very simple, you know, and I think that's half its charm. Sometimes with Genesis it's a bit overworked and we sort of put too much into things, and something like this, which is, you know, almost a sort of bog standard sort of chord sequence in a way. Well, the chorus is a little bit different, but it just gave it somewhere to go. And I think I don't know why. You know, what is it? It's got it. I think the sort of the fact the song slowly crescendos, you know, and it kind of just sort of creeps into you like that. It's got a very strong chorus hook as well, I think. Which is why I think why audiences like it, I don't know really. It shines out a little bit from the album in terms of its sort of its solidity and confidence, I think, because the other songs I say are all a bit more meandering, and you think there's one very sort of bright spark in the middle of the album like this, which at the time we wrote it, we had no idea that it was going to be picked out like that. You know, we played the album to people and we thought that probably the single would, if there was going to be a single, it would be Counting Out Time, and everyone said no, Carpet Crawlers is the one, you know. We released the single, of course, it wasn't a hit or anything, but we've tried again. We've tried a couple of times since then releasing it. It's still never done anything.
Early morning, man had on ocean winds blow on the land. Movie palaces now undone.
I think the title track, you know, the opening track, I think is great. The piano riff, and Pete sets up the image, describing the New York scenes, you know. Early morning skyline, those sort of lines, you know, I think they really paint a picture of the album.
Rise down on Broadway.
I remember it. We were really pushed to get the album finished, and we were at Island Studios. And by this point we had a day shift and a night shift, and I was on the night shift with Peter, I think, and the day shift was Tony and Mike and Steve. And we did a mix of it, me and Pete, and then the other guys came in and thought we were mad and changed everything, and there was a bit of friction there, I remember. But we were just trying to get it finished and try and get it out.
I'm counting out time, got the whole thing down by numbers, all those numbers give me guidance.
Well, I think Counting Out Time is played because it's a pop song, you know, in the way that some of the other ones are. It's that was a song of Pete's, actually, Counting Out Time, entirely, which I think is a good little song. I mean, it works very nicely, you know. I think it's it's good in context of the album again because it's simpler compared with a lot of the other things.
I think Counting Out Time was the nearest thing to a single on the album, but it was a trifle risque.
It's all about early sexual experiences, trying to do it by the book.
Possibly not as strong as it could be musically. I think you need a bit more of a hook than just da 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 da, you know.
I love Back in New York City. That was just a weird track. I mean, it was just out there, so heavy for us.
Back in New York City.
I think I wrote it with the band. I can't remember actually, but I think it was sort of, and a lot of jamming, a lot of improvising. And I know we were conscious at the time. We were thinking that it's kind of a shame when Pete wanted to move on because we thought this is sounding really good musically, very strong. And I think at the end it's still a strong piece.
That started off as a riff of Mike's. He just had this idea of playing on. He had a 6-string bass and he was playing this riff on it. And then we sort of developed that as a song. And then Pete just did this sort of shouting type vocal on it, which was kind of, at the time, was sort of quite surprising, you know. But I think it works pretty well. Again, I think the song is a bit more complicated than it needs to be. I think there's a couple of little extra bits in the middle there that should probably, courtesy of me, in fact, I think, which probably be better off if they weren't there. But they are there, so that's what you've got.
People have covered it. I mean, Back in New York City has been covered by a couple of different bands recently that I've got. You know, I managed to get hold of these things when I hear about them. But yeah, I mean, just from my point of view as a player, I mean, I was playing. I mean, I went to see the Musical Box play this in its entirety, and I was amazed at just how complicated it was. And this guy was playing it well, but I mean, I must have played it better. You know what I mean? Because I wrote it, and I mean, my drum set was like, you know, like huge. I mean, it wasn't like a big drum kit. It was just like lots of noises here, lots of things there, and I was whizzing around it. I mean, it was probably the height. I mean, certainly between that and then the next 3 or 4 years with Brand X and Genesis, that was probably the height of my playing, you know. But a lot of inventive stuff, you know, from everybody. I mean, Steve was, you know, like a great sound guy, and, you know, Tony was getting the maximum out of what he had. You know, we were onto the double neck kind of thing with the guitar and bass. It seemed to be a very, you know, a surge forward, really. Well, I just think that they display a side of Genesis that no one really, well, everyone forgets, apart from the ardent fan, that they forget or they've never heard. And I think it's actually the way we start writing now, by doing things like that. That's how I Can't Dance started. That's how No Son of Mine started. That's how all these songs. That's how we used to write. You know, we just would start playing, and our brief on the waiting room, for example, was the mood we want is darkness to light. And I remember I had this. I think it's out there as a bootleg. I don't know how, because I had the only cassette. But I used to cassette everything. I was the keeper of the tapes. You know, I'm still the writer of the minutes of the meetings. You know, but we started making noises. Steve with his darkness and lots of rain sticks and eerie noises, and suddenly, you know, Tony would start playing these chords, and I went drum, 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 and literally it was pouring with rain outside, and we kind of Tony put some chords in, and suddenly it started changing rhythm from dum 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 ding 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 ding, and there was a rainbow, and it stopped raining, and the sun came out. I mean, it's most era. I mean, cosmic thing. You know. I mean, nothing. I just only report the news. I don't make it. I was there, and it happened, and it was the most amazing thing. And it kind of, it was just a little golden 8 or 9 minute moment. And that's what we. Those are the bits that I remember, and I think it would be good if people kind of remembered that side of it. That's the same band, like Silent Sorrow and Empty Boats, which is like, you know, sailing ships, you know, like clouds, and fog. The same band that plays Hold On My Heart. The same band that plays the songs that they say we've sold out to. It's the same band, you know, it's the same mentality.
It's the last great invention left to mankind. Screams a
sleeping lady, offering her dream dolls at less than extortionate prices.
Eno was upstairs taking Tiger Mountain by strategy, and Peter was a fan of Roxy music. I guess they were. I'd never heard of rock. I've heard of them, but I'd never heard their music. Anyway, he asked Eno to come down and put the vocals through his ARP. So he did, and that Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging was one of the things he did. And after we'd finished that, some deal was made, and I was sent upstairs to play drums on Eno's record, which was fine by me because I ended up getting to know him very well and playing on Another Green World and Before and After Science and Music for Films, and we've stayed in touch. But I felt like some kind of prostitute, He's come down and played on our record. Now you're going to have to go and pay him back. Like what do I have to do? Just play the drums. Oh, good.
I was and am still, a fan of what Brian does and brings to projects, and it just seemed like this was for us an adventurous album, and that I really wanted him to come in and wave his magic wand over a few of the sort of sound areas, which we called enosification.
It's a funny album, this really, because I suppose it's sort of looked back on as something of a classic. I didn't really enjoy sort of writing or making this album to the same extent as I did all the other albums. I mean, there's a lot of my stuff on this album, I have to say. A lot of bits some bits I had around for a while, and particularly with the bits that ended up in obviously The Lamb and The Cage and and Lamy and Slipperman and all that sort of stuff. And we did a lot of improvising as well and created these bits. And I think some of the most exciting bits on the album are actually these little interludes that we had. One of my favourite ones is the one we ended up calling a Fly on a Windshield, I think, which was originally was called Pharaohs. And we just sort of sat down and was playing sort of fifths and just making it sort of like the Egyptian army sort of coming across the landscape was the idea. And we had a sort of quiet one and a loud one, and we just sort of butt joined them. But then with the lyric, the idea of this sort of fly hitting a windshield, and of course it comes in with such a big bang, which is probably the single best moment in Genesis. I think that's just that moment when it comes in, that first chord. After that, it's just downhill, but it's just a wonderful moment, I think.
And I'm hovering like a fly, waiting for the windshield on the freeway.
I was trying very, very hard to get my guitar through the mix a lot of the time, and trying very hard, very, very dense keyboard textures, and I'm always trying to do something to highlight and try and do something sympathetic in the background. Although you've got guitar moments like Fly on a Windshield, where you've got the guitar doing something where it sometimes comes to the fore and rises and falls, and so I think that is a lovely piece of music. So as a guitarist, I love that.
I wandered lonely as a cloud till I came upon this dirty street.
I've always loved visual things, and obviously since then, and it's the chance of having interesting looking visuals or get a reaction from people, much in the same way that the Fox's head and the dress had got a strong reaction. The Slipper Man, was a really ugly looking thing, and I would crawl out of his phallus, which would unroll on the stage, and it was a great moment.
I was starting to sort of just feel like the music was being overshadowed by the visuals, which were getting a little bit out of hand. I mean, the idea of having these screens behind us was fantastic, but I mean, they never worked. I think we had maybe 4 shows in 100. When everything actually changed at the right moment. We sort of 2 eyes. We had an eye and a New York street scene, because the slide changer didn't work. And we, all that stuff was frustrating, but it was nothing we could do about it. But there was 2 things. One was the Lamia, where this thing came down, and Peter was in the middle of it, and sometimes the microphone cord would get caught up with the top or the bottom of it, and so either it didn't move or he had to move with it. It was all very Spinal Tap, but, I mean, it was cutting edge, but Spinal Tap. And the worst was the Slippin' Man, where he came through this inflatable dick, and dressed in this horrible outfit, which sometimes got a little bit stuck on the way out, and other times when he did make it out, the microphone could barely get near his throat, and then he was out of breath. I mean, there's a lot of words in that song, and he was running around. I mean, he kind of hadn't really thought it through, I don't think.
Phil's absolutely correct that it was bloody hard to sing inside there. We didn't have those little tiny mics, so inside this mask I was trying to hold the microphone and tripping up over things, and at different points I'd crawl under Tony's organ, appear at different places, but it was just trying to explore things and push it a lot and have fun, because it was fun. But again, it was a little like with the lyric. I knew that if everything went to the vote, it would die a horrible death. So, again, the way it was performed, I mean, there was, I would, on the visual stuff and the slides, I worked a lot with this Jeffrey Shaw and Theo Bodschreiber, and then, we'd have sessions, and then I would sort of present them to the band, and Jeffrey was a very good people person. That side of things, there weren't any real problems or battles once people felt good that there was something interesting and of quality coming. But as always, what I did in terms of masks, costumes and all that stuff, I just had to get on with it and not offer it up to the vote.
It's what Spinal Tap was written for. It's funny, and it was adventurous, and it was edgy, and it was like nobody else, and we should be thankful that we were all in the same band experiencing it. But I didn't think it was very musical, that's all.
Well, I think it works pretty well. Obviously, it's the idea was it's showing sort of images from the story and everything, and it has that kind of it has a sort of a graphic novel sort of quality about it, which I quite like, because I'm a bit of a graphic novel fan, and so I quite like the sort of dark thing about it. I think it was, it was a question of how we used it, whether we used it sort of bigger and over the whole album, or whether we just used that sort of band of stuff. I think it works pretty well. I mean, it's in a lot of character, and also the writing, that sort of Greek lettering we used, which we've obviously come back to a few times later in our career, I think looks very strong on it, really. I think it was good because it gave whereas all of the previous albums all been a bit more romantic, this was a lot less romantic, this album, and having a stark black and white cover like that, I think it made it, you're aware that this wasn't going to be quite as sort of cuddly, perhaps, as some of the previous stuff.
I really liked Storm. It was a wonderful character, very dry, cynical, sardonic, and very talented. And he was just a lot of fun to interact with. He was always rude to everybody, and but when you're riffing ideas, it's a lot of fun. And he also has this bag of the unused hypnosis ideas that he tries to palm off on everyone as new and fresh, but here there was a story and some strong ideas for pictures. I had a sort of Puerto Rican figure in my head who, perhaps West Side Story was maybe another influence as well as El Topo. But the faces that they were able to find in the UK didn't seem anything like what I had in my head, and I remember a big search to try and find someone acceptable as Rael, because I thought the face has to be right. And I think we got pretty close, but it was sort of like 8.5 out of 10.
Hypnosis for years have been trying to get us to use a photographic cover. They always wanted everything to be edgy realism, and the band always wanted something much more, to their mind, that what Hypnosis considered to be airy-fairy. Oh yes, you want all this romantic stuff. Why can't you have something which is contemporary, photographic, literal, perspectives-driven, just like all their other covers? And the cover, I don't think it's the greatest cover ever. I think that Hypnosis did do great covers. occasionally for Led Zeppelin, who I think were perhaps more open to some of their ideas. Like I remember them saying, what about if we have a family sitting around and they're staring at something in the middle of the table and no one really knows what it is? And everyone says, no, don't like that. But everyone was sure that they didn't want their photograph on the front. No one wanted their own face to be on the front of the album. Probably not until Phil did Face Value, but that's another story.
Yeah, I feel it's a little bit as confused as the story. You know, I mean, it's a distinct package. I don't think I've ever read the story inside it, actually. It's been one of those things where it's something I should have done and then it became too late and there was something else to do, so I never... But again, you know, it's difficult. When someone plonks an album in front of you to sign, what you're signing, you know, very quickly someone goes, okay, picture, you know. The filing cabinet in your head goes back to all the things that... So every album cover has, straight away, even though you're signing your name on something that's 30 years old plus, it has those sort of emotional attachments. Some good, some not so good, but at least evoke something.
I guess maybe because it was in part a visualization of a story that I may have moved beyond the democratic process, and that didn't go down well.
Fragrance to flavors strange, a magnificent chamber.
Pete said he was going to leave, and he did. And I remember talking to him on a plane one day. I said, "Are you seriously going to leave at the end of this?" I mean, he said, "Yeah, afraid so. Yeah, I made up my mind." And he's putting me on. It's all part of the act. It's all part of the show. It's like the makeup. It's going to come off. But no, it was not an act. It was real.
As I said many times, when Peter and I started off in the group as sort of, kind of very best friends, I suppose, really. And obviously by then it was getting a little more difficult, I think, particularly within the group. So yes, it was a sort of sad time in that way. And you sort of felt that, particularly once when we did the tour, which was, we did about 100 shows of The Lamb, which wasn't a fantastic show, to be honest, I don't think. Although we tried very hard and had lots of good effects. It was trying to do the whole album, to an audience who really wanted to hear a lot of the old hits, made it a little more difficult.
But it was a bit strange to be carrying on doing gigs knowing the singer was leaving. I must admit, it was a bit strange. Must have been strange, And then I think the last gig was cancelled, so the gig we were actually at became our last show. So that was a bit of anticlimax. There was no kind of build-up because the next show had been cancelled because no one bought tickets. Toulouse, we all disagree on where the last show is. It's incredible. I'm convinced that Toulouse was cancelled and we ended it with the five of us in Besançon. Everybody else tells me we ended in Saint-Etienne, but you think someone would know, wouldn't you? Apparently I'm wrong, but I'm pretty convinced I'm right. Anyway, the last show was cancelled, so that was the end of that.
I think I started to have some frustration of sort of not being part of the keyboard side of things, I have very strong ideas on how things should sound and how you mix things together, and so I think there may have been some frustrations in that department.
I think something happened when he left for a bit, and you're in your mind you're thinking, wait a minute, this guy's maybe he's going to pull somewhere else, different directions. He wants to think outside the band. And so when he finally did break the news, it was not such a huge shock. We had a kind of pre-warning, we just managed to persuade Tony Smith to leave his business and become a manager. Poor guy like that, suddenly, the singer leaves. And I'm sure he thought, oh God, what have I done? But it's funny. In a sense, talking about it now, you said it seems a long period. It's not a long period, you're right. But I'm talking about it now. I think a lot of tours, a lot of work, a lot of gigs, a lot of music in a sort of 5-year period, actually. I remember seeing once the list of gigs we did 1 year. It was like 190 or no 200 in 1 year. No, 210 in 1 year. That's a lot of gigs. But it became a bit of a landmark album and an end of an era too, I think.
I mean, one of the several reasons why I left was because that I didn't feel able to control, or that I was in charge of my life, that I could just look on the calendar and see exactly where I was going to be 18 months from today, and I never liked that feeling.
I have to say that there's been sort of little rumours on and off throughout the years that because of my apparent, unhappiness at Pete's visuals, that I was either an instigator of him leaving, pleased that he left so I could sing. None of that is true. I love Peter to this day, as if we've always been close. I played on his album. I played for him as his drummer for free because he couldn't afford a band at one point. We did gigs when he was routining the third album. I love the guy. Went to his wedding and you came to mine. We all get on great, but I've always felt very, very close to Pete. And I was very sad when he left, but we had to get on with it. And I didn't want to be the singer at all because I was the drummer. And by that point, I was a very good drummer. So why would I want to sing? We couldn't find anybody else. So if we couldn't find anybody else, that was the end of it. Or have someone that didn't really make the grade, So bit by bit, I ended up doing the singing. And but people always take the short story. They take the shortest route, and they think Phil's the singer. He's had a go at Pete. He wanted him out.
It's bullshit. Phil, some people think, that Phil was sort of chomping at the bit, waiting to get rid of me. And it wasn't like that at all. I think he loved being a drummer, and although I think was beginning to write songs and enjoy being a singer, for quite some time the band didn't consider him as the singer, and I don't think he really considered himself as the singer for Genesis. So that evolved slowly. It was clear to me that he could have a big career on his own, and I remember saying that to him and to the rest of the band at the time, and because, as I said, we would often be there hammering out our own things, which were sounding quite different from what the band was doing. It wasn't. I never had the feeling that the band wanted to get rid of me at any time, and I think because we started the tour for the Lamb and that got great reactions, people were hoping that things would all heal, and then we got to the Midwest of America, and it just got too much for me, and I just knew that I was drowning and had to head up for air.
I think it's looked upon now like in the same way that James Dean, only made 3 films, I think, 4 films, but everyone thinks he's a wonderful actor, and I think everyone looks back at The Lamb with a lot of reverence, but they didn't like it at the time. I think it was, but I'm glad that they got round to it now, but it didn't take the world by storm when it came out, that's for sure.
Musically, there was a confidence and an assurance about what we were doing as writers and players, more than on any other record up to that point. So, there were all these different sort of out of balance elements that ended up making what I think is a good record. There's 1 or 2 weak points where it sort of fizzled out in places, but some of our strongest work.
Yeah, the good bits are good. It was a long album to make. I think a double album is hard to do, especially if things aren't going quite right, like Pete leaving for a bit. And on reflection, I guess it had to be that way. Pete would write all the lyrics. You couldn't mix it up, but it made it. His workload very, very hard, and I think I took him away from us really, and sort of he just got into a space and just worked on lyrics, and did some great lyrics, but it's still quite. It slightly made us two camps, so to speak. But a good way to end, I think,
Well, I can listen to it without rancor, and I don't remember the pain. I just can enjoy it as a piece of music now, and say, yeah, I think it was a clever album. Lots of great keyboard work, not so many opportunities for the guitar to shine, but where it does, I think it's interesting. I tend to think that it parallels, yes, doing Topographic Oceans at that point, a double concept album, and us doing a double album, and I know that very often the guys have felt that maybe it would have made a great single album if the best stuff had been kept. But what would you have kept? What would you have thrown away? Kept my bit, of course. To hell with all the rest.
No, I think it's great that we went out on a good piece of work. And there was never really bad feeling with the individuals. I mean, we had, like any sort of divorce, there was difficulties, but most of what they wanted, I was prepared to give them, including extra touring time and my tape archive, most of the equipment and stuff. And so it was, at that point, I think they were worried whether they'd be able to continue without me. And clearly they were much more successful without me. So there was actually no real issue. But I think everyone had doubts and were very frustrated because we worked a long time to get some success. We were about to get some financial rewards, which we hadn't fully paid off. So when this bastard goes and sabotages the whole thing just as it gets successful, that wasn't a popular thing to do from a career point of view.
I think it's quite a difficult album. It's very dark and quite dense. But I think, therefore, people sort of, I think people, if you try it, and it still works really well, I think, and I think it's rewarding, and perhaps it takes a little bit more to get into it in the first place, and maybe for that reason, people, once they've got there, hold it up like that. But I think, in honesty, that's the thing about Genesis. Is a strange thing. We don't have any one album that everyone's going to say this is the one. Pink Floyd have got Dark Side of the Moon, whatever. With us, you'll get people saying any album. I've had every album said this is the one, part possibly from Genesis Revelation. I think it's just how you hear things. Sometimes it's at what point in your life you hear a thing, and you're a teenager or something hits you harder when you're sort of 15 than it does perhaps when you're sort of 25, and so it stays with you for that reason.